Good afternoon, everyone, and please come in. I see there's some folks in the back there. I'm Mary Woolley, the CEO of Research America. It's a real pleasure to have you with us today. We have, my team and I put the emphasis on this great team, have put together a fabulous National Health Research Forum for the 29th year in a row. And the first half was yesterday, our virtual program, and that will be available, as will this part, on social media and in other ways for you to access if you missed a session. And there were some great ones yesterday, and there will be again today. The theme, the sort of byline of this forum from the beginning, all those years ago, has been straight talk. We do our best to cut right to the chase, to talk about the challenges as well as the opportunities the way they really are. No sugarcoating, no shying away from things that are hard. But if we weren't taking on the things that were hard, we wouldn't be fully fulfilling all the spectacular leadership abilities of folks in this room and your colleagues around the country. If you are a member of Research America, we thank you for your continued partnership and support. We value the opportunity to work with and learn from you. Research America itself is a relatively small organization, but our ability to have impact is based on our networks, our alliance. We believe in the alliance concept of making big things happen. Now, the challenges that we're facing today in the context of a tumultuous, some would say, election season are multifaceted. And the challenges include bolstering the STEM bolstering the STEM workforce to innovating for clinical trials, from working to improve mental health, and increasing trust in science, from weighing in on policy changes that are in play as we speak, to maximizing innovation in health systems research, and into ensuring patient engagement across the entire research ecosystem. These are huge challenges, and they extend to challenges across the broad science and technology enterprise, where some challenges are similar and some are broader and involve some topics we're going to be hearing about today. Very much stay tuned. We're honored, in fact, to hear throughout our forum from so many eminent leaders who are working to speed the pace of medical progress, improve lives of patients here and across the globe. And we're thrilled to be hearing from leaders in industry and patient groups and the federal health and research agencies, such as the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the National Science Foundation, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. And thank you to all our participants. We are grateful, very grateful, to our sponsors and partners who are listed on the screen now for supporting this event. Thank you to our principal sponsors, Johnson & Johnson and Pfizer, our supporting partner, Sanofi, our collaborating sponsors, the American Association of Medical Colleges, AdvaMed, Amgen, Colgate, Columbia University, Elsevier, Eli Lilly and Company, Novartis, Novo Nordisk, and the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, or PCORI. And we thank our contributing sponsor, Eisai. And we thank our event sponsors, the American Society for Microbiology, GRAIL, KDCR Partners, Pharma, and Ultragenics. We appreciate especially the opportunity to be with you today at the George Washington University in this beautiful Jack Morton Auditorium. Every time I'm in here, I'm just in awe. The university, GW University, has been a gracious host, and we're so pleased that we could join here today. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the podium Dr. Barbara Bass, the Dean of the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. Barbara.
Thank you, Mary. Great to be here. Welcome, everyone, and welcome to those online, too, I hope. My name is Barbara Bass. I'm the VP for Health Affairs and the Dean of the George Washington University School of Medicine and Health Sciences. And I have the great, distinct pleasure of getting to welcome you here to GW on behalf of the entire university. We are just thrilled to death that Research America has selected our Foggy Bottom campus, this great little spot in Northwest DC here, for organizing such outstanding programming that's being shared with such a distinguished group. No question, the conferences that Research America are vital, like Research America, are vital for us to come together and to share insights on our current situation, many as they will be, and to collaboratively outline a way forward, leveraging all the wisdom and intelligence and research that we possibly can. I appreciate that each of you brings valuable perspectives here today, each unique, whether you are from industry, not-for-profits, patient groups, government, or the academy. It's great to have everyone in the room. And no question, essential, thoughtful dialogue is the way we're going to address the world's most urgent and intractable problems through multidisciplinary, interinstitutional, and indeed global efforts across all boundaries to solve some of these most challenging problems. Here at GW, our strengths come not only from the power of place, but we do kind of feel it when we're here on this campus, here in Washington, D.C., this nation's capital city, but also, of course, from the talent of our the power of our very talented faculty and people that make up this great university. And we do have a broad spectrum of that talent here at GW and areas of focus from the leading academic medical enterprise that I'm proud to lead, to our experience in law, policy, international affairs. We are deeply committed to STEM, as well as a culture of creativity and innovation at all levels of our educational programs, and indeed that trickles, of course, into our research initiatives as well. In addition to the contributions of the faculty of the School of Medicine and Health Sciences, the School of Nursing, and the Milken Institute School of Public Health, GW scholars in the arts, humanities, social sciences, and STEM are also exploring the human experience, humanity and societal impacts of medical advances, and technologies. In fact, GW is home to more than 30 cross-disciplinary research institutes. We have very well-established institutes on computational biology, neuroscience, global women's issues, on and on and on. Really a diverse and, I'm going to say, exhaustive portfolio. And we've added new initiatives just in these last couple of years on global food, on racial equity, and most relevant perhaps to all of our lives in the coming years, trustworthy AI. All of these connect directly to our GW institutional priorities and, of course, permeate into the lives of the people we serve. Our academic medical enterprise is very proud to have made major investments in the last few years in our cancer programs, having built now substantial discovery, translational, and clinical research programs that have propelled us on our way to designation as an MCI-designated cancer center. A comprehensive cancer center, I expect we'll have that application ready to go within just the next couple of years. These centers are highly interdisciplinary and integrate, of course, clinical care of the highest orders with robust educational programming as well. Our Biostatistics Center, which is part of the School of Public Health, led by Dean Lynn Goldman, is having a large impact on the prevention and treatment of diabetes by coordinating the design and analysis of large clinical trials in that and many other diseases. The Fitzhugh Mullen Institute focuses on development of the health workforce with an emphasis on health equity. It draws on the expertise of faculty from most of our colleges and schools here at GW. GW researchers are leading the DC AIDS Research Center. This center, with a long history, formed in fact at the dawn of the pandemic of that dread disease, which is now a livable condition for many, most. This center collaborates with virtually every academic institution in DC, as well as all of our community health organizations. The School of Medicine and Health Sciences has just recently established a new Office of Clinical Research that's enabling our participation in an ongoing, expanding array of clinical trials, clinical and translational research portfolio. We have been involved in many, many areas of personalized and targeted therapies, as well as vaccine development in recent years. Another recently launched institute envisions an evidence-based response to mitigate the climate crisis and equitably improve public health. The Climate Health Institute is using data gathered via satellite to map air quality down to the neighborhood level, as you may have recently heard in the national news. It's exciting work that's happening here at GW, and these are just a few of the highlights of the impactful work that our community is delivering. But we know that we need to do it with partnership of others, and I'm so glad that in this room we've gathered many, many who can become those future collaborators and organizations that will amplify our impact and help us translate our scholarship into real action. Before I turn off this turn off this welcome and turn you on to the exciting scientific programs ahead, I got to tell you just one thing about our School of Medicine and Health Sciences. We're actually in the midst of our bicentennial year. We are 200 years old this year, which is quite an astounding accomplishment, in my humble opinion. We were the first medical school in the nation's capital and the 11th oldest in the country, which means we've been training generations of compassionate, capable healthcare professionals for 200 years now. Medicine was one of the original programs listed in the university's charter that was signed by President James Monroe on February 9th, 1821. So our university celebrated its bicentennial 3 years ago with the opening of the Columbia College that year. 3 years later, after hearing appeals from two medical professors, the GW trustees also rapidly organized the creation of a new Department of Medicine. Bylaws and regulations were adopted on October 19th, 1824, with lectures for the medical students, new students, beginning on March 30th, 1825. Corresponding with these dates, our bicentennial celebration will close on March 30th, 2025, which also happens to mark the 20th, which marks therefore the 200th anniversary of our student learning, and it also just happens to coincide with Doctors' Day, National Doctors' Day. Kind of fun. But we are very proud of that, and it's a unique accomplishment for our university, of course. Today, the School of Medicine and Health Sciences does account for about 30% of the university's research activity funding, and we are definitely on the rise, having seen about a 30% increase over the last 5 years in that funding, which really helps bolster our university's proud new status of being a member in the AAU. So, as you enjoy your remarkable presentations this afternoon, I thank you again for joining us here. I hope you will consider our opportunities for collaboration here in GW with our magnificent faculty across all of our schools with a wide array of expertise. Again, enjoy your afternoon, and thank you so much for having selected GW for this, to host this wonderful event.
Happy 200th birthday, wow. I just went to my aunt's 101 birthday party, very small group, but she's doing great, but wow, 200. So our first session today is entitled Navigating the Intersection of AI and Drug Development, Opportunities and Challenges. Quite timely. The panel discussion will be led by Dan Vergano, the Senior Opinion Editor at Scientific American. And Dan will be joined this afternoon by Dr. Lori Locascio, the Undersecretary of Commerce for Science and Technology and the Director of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, or NIST. Also with us on the panel is Dr. Aida Habtezion, the Chief Medical Officer at Pfizer, and Dr. David Reese, the Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer at Amgen and a Research America board member. And Dr. Marius Linguraru, Linguraru, I think I got it, the Connor Family Professor and Chair of Research and Innovation at Children's National Hospital right here in Washington, D.C. So thanks to all our panelists for being with us, and I'll turn it over to you, Dan. They're here. Dan, where are you? Oh, there you are.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks very much for the introduction, Mary. Thank you all for being here. So as you heard, we're going to be talking about AI and the world of healthcare and what's going on right now. And it's fair to say that it's a pretty exciting time to be talking about this. Once science fiction, now reality. We are actually moving into drug development and healthcare being bettered by artificial intelligence. So we're going to dive into a little bit of the basics, a little bit of the ethical and regulatory issues, and as well as some of the promise and some of the pitfalls of this exciting new technology. And we're going to solve it all in an hour. So all your questions, you will no longer have any after we get done here. Just to begin, I'm going to hit Dave up to try and give us the basics, sort of, what is the picture for artificial intelligence in the world of healthcare?
Well, that's a vast topic. So let me start, let's level up, start at a really high level. This, in our view, is a once-in-a-generation moment. It is a once-in-a-generation moment when technology has the potential and will almost certainly change almost everything that we do. Now, I'm the Chief Technology Officer for a biotechnology company. We believe it will permeate every aspect of our business, drug discovery, drug development, manufacturing, commercialization, how we actually seek safety signals on the market. All of these sorts of things will, I think, yield to a much better level of understanding. Let me give you just a few examples to get us started. So, in the realm of basic biology, we have a collection now of what we call human data, genomic data, proteomic data, which is a measurement of all the proteins, for example, in your blood at any given time, transcriptomic data, a record of which genes are turned off and turned on, coupled with dense phenotypic data, everything from your hair color to your blood pressure to your CT scan results. All of that is about 300 petabytes of data. We've recently installed an NVIDIA SuperPod to begin generating artificial intelligence models to probe that data set to really understand disease biology at a much more basic level.
What is an NVIDIA SuperPod?
So an NVIDIA SuperPod, everyone who hasn't heard of NVIDIA. So we've all heard of NVIDIA. An NVIDIA SuperPod is their latest array using chips that gives you the computational power, the ability to do trillions of calculations a second, for example, that then tries to make tractable or solvable problems that otherwise couldn't be attacked. Always stop me if I'm becoming a little more technical, but that's just one example. In clinical development, in our manufacturing plants, we're infusing AI and robotics to make them more efficient and make the drug process safer. And then, there's a whole realm, as I said, for instance, in tracking safety of a drug once it's on the market. The current state of the art is actually not great right now from a regulatory and from an industry and academic position. We can probably make that much better. That's a tiny flavor, I think, of where we're starting.
Very good. And that very nicely leads into my sort of first area that we're going to talk about a little bit, which is this being Washington, the regulatory and ethical sort of landscape that we're dealing with here. I'm going to ask Aida to first talk about it from sort of a Pfizer viewpoint, leader in AI in healthcare and drug development. What do you see as sort of the regulatory and ethical landscape that we're dealing with?
Thank you, Dan. I think, of course, like everything else, as Dave mentioned, this is a technology that is rapidly evolving. So I think we also need to think about in terms of how we bring medicines and vaccines to the world is we always think, of course, of the ethical and regulatory, and there is no reason why we shouldn't think of it differently. I mean, these are technologies that are augmenting, accelerating in terms of what we do. So I think it is important to think about that human oversight, the guardrails. I think we have to think of that at Pfizer, and I don't think it's necessarily unique, but it's a way that we have to approach it in a similar way, thinking about the benefits and risk, understanding the limitations. I think even if we are still at a phase, maybe at a junction, maybe we are at the tip actually in terms of how we're using these tools is as we are understanding it is to continuously monitor. And I think from an ethical perspective, it's important to remember that where do we insert, because we are not at a point where we automate everything and we let this thing go run wild. And so I think it is very important to understand where we center. I think these are going to help us, of course, and they're accelerating in many ways. And we can talk about the examples where we are really implementing AI to really help us, whether it's with workflow operations or it is with transformative type of changes. So we do need to think, however, as institutions to implement responsible AI. And we do have that in terms of how we are thinking. And it's about bringing cross-functional teams, right? Teams who understand clinical judgment, ethics, and regulatory space really to navigate, and how do we work with the engineers, how do we work with the technicality, and thinking about the things that, for example, biases and fairness, we need to think about these early, like whatever, because they are tools. Whatever data we feed it is going to be the data that it's going to be trained and be validated. So I think it's very important to think about these biases, whether it's the people who are developing it or the people who are implementing and launching it. So I think it is important. And I think when it comes to ethical, I think even if we don't have a solution for every problem, transparency is very important, particularly for those that is intended use. I think what it's indicated is very important to have that transparency and understanding how these tools are coming to a decision. And we shouldn't forget, of course, the regulatory framework in terms of thinking about HIPAA, if it's in Europe, of course, GDPR, and all these things in terms of patient consent and also protecting patient privacy. My role, of course, as Chief Medical Officer and Head of Worldwide Medical and Safety, I always think of the safety hat. So I think it's very important that we are thinking about their safe uses. And then as I mentioned, is understanding their limitations and where we need to use it and where we need to implement, the human judgment and humans in the loop. So I think some of these things that is very important that we need to think, creating that oversight and also the guardrails for these tools.
So she's anticipated some of my questions. We'll get into more of that as we go on. That was sort of a Pfizer viewpoint. Let me ask Dave, Amgen, is there a different approach, or how would you say you've led AI there for a while? So
yeah, I think it's basically the same approach. As Ida said, you apply the same regulatory and ethical framework that you've developed. Now, there may need to be additional technical checks on what the outputs actually are, but I don't think the basic principles don't differ. And in fact, we've developed a very specific set of guidelines and a process to have, for example, an AI model checked to ensure that it is compliant, that it is operating within the appropriate ethical frameworks and regulatory frameworks. So I think we probably make too much of the fact that will be qualitatively different. I don't think that's the case.
And just so I'm clear, we have NIST on stage, but who are the regulatory players here? I assume it's FDA. Are there other folks? Please go ahead. Yeah, speak to that. Yeah, I have more questions for you.
We are non-regulatory.
Yeah, you're not.
So when we develop guidelines, what we're really trying to do is develop tools that people can use to address trustworthiness of AI models, and therefore the application of AI into various sectors and various spaces. And it's interesting because all new technologies, when they first come into play, even 100 years ago, the newest technology that was on the market engendered sort of either distrust, fear, or just general cynicism. And so I think people come into any new technology with that kind of like, oh, what is this? And now we need to figure out how to develop the tools by which to trust it, right? And so that's really what NIST's role is. It's not regulatory. It's to provide those tools that engender trust in new technology. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about some of those tools that NIST does develop.
Yeah, I mean, I should go, and I've made a note to myself to ask you in particular about the NIST framework. For Aida. Could you, what is that, and what does it do?
Yeah, so the NIST framework, we released the AI risk management framework, and that's a tool to help organizations figure out how to understand.
It's a voluntary guide.
It's a voluntary guide that is broadly adopted, I would say, not only in the United States, but globally, with intention, because when we developed it, this risk management framework, which is really a tool for organizations to pick up to figure out how they can manage the risk in their own organization of adopting AI. And we developed it with input from a lot of different stakeholders. We had a lot of industry input, large and small, into the development of the risk management framework. But we also had a lot of global players come into the conversation and provide their input. Honestly, that was fantastic, because the world is thinking about how are we going to manage risks, and all the countries are thinking about how do we try to mitigate risks associated with AI adoption. And therefore, the follow-on is then how do we regulate? Well, if we all come to the table and are trying to figure out together how we can manage risk in these voluntary frameworks, then as these become standards, then the natural follow-on to standards is it becomes a regulation. It can be adopted into regulation. You bring people along with you all the way, right? With the right experts, the people who are making the models, the people who are developing the models, the people who are trying to apply the models, civil society, everybody comes to the table. And the risk management framework is really developed as a tool for people to say, okay, how are we going to map the risk, manage the risk, govern the risks associated?
One simple framework that we use is to ask the basic question up front: what's the intended use? What is the intended use? And given that intended use, what should be the guardrails? And then what process do you establish to ensure you're adhering to those guardrails?
Well, I think also, sorry.
No, please go ahead. Yes. I'd rather you guys talk to each other than me.
No. But I think the guardrail conversation is an important one, because these kinds of approaches that we put on paper, the frameworks that we all develop and we start using, then become the rules of the road that eventually become the guardrails that are picked up and adopted globally.
So I should ask the entire group the bigger question of how are you balancing the sort of the need for transparency that some of you have already mentioned against the needs of a study for privacy of your patients and for reliable data. And I guess I should start with Marius, because I haven't let him talk yet. But that seems like to me to be a crux of the issue here, if that makes sense.
Right, and I think we heard already about some fantastic examples where AI works in drug development, and I'll come back to the theme, right, of our conversation here. Drug development is important, and I think AI is making the cost of drug development faster. It's shortening the path to the market and in the end to the patient. These are things that get me very exciting. It helps with drug repurposing. I work in pediatric healthcare, and drugs developed for adults sometimes don't work for kids, but sometimes they might. We're just not ready to use it yet. With AI, we learn that much faster. I think Aida knows very well how Pfizer used AI to facilitate the development of Paxlovid, but also how to find a molecule that allow Paxlovid to be taken orally rather than intravenously. These are big things that we know about. But AI is still very, very good at data analytics and understanding and processing vast amounts of data. Data that comes from patient records, that can come from genomic, proteomics, as Dave was saying, they can come from your home, from everything that we're recording there now. And these are patterns that are so complex for our eyes, for our brain, that the machine can discover much faster. But I work in a field where data is not a privilege. Working with kids and vulnerable populations, you hit those roadblocks very, very fast. Data, how do we get it? Kids are about 27% of the world population. But when I looked a couple of weeks ago at publications with AI in pediatrics, only 2.4% of those papers address pediatric healthcare, 2.4 to 27. We have a huge gap there. That means we don't have the data because kids don't speak for themselves, kids don't have the funds, their parents may not have the funds to support them. So it's all a matter of investment and accessibility. And when we're talking about healthcare divide and digital divide in the world, we hit much, much bigger barriers there. So what I think, to come to your question, when we're looking at data, first of all, we have to have what I'll call the 4 principles of health equity, and you may agree with those. There are many others that need to be considered, so please be patient with just these 4, but those are availability, accessibility, fairness, quality, and efficiency. And to hit these things and to get the data for all of these pillars, it is really important to use technology, because technology can go there faster, can acquire data, and can make it safe. We know how to do AI algorithms basically in the classic manner. We get as much data as we can, we train a very smart algorithm, and we get results. This is, again, something we don't get for rare diseases. Rare diseases are those that have less than 20,000 patients in the US, but they make up to 1 trillion patients worldwide. So we want to have AI helping those individuals as well. And some of the work that I do, my team, we know how to work with little data and to get access to it. And maybe one point I would like to make about safeguarding access to that, sharing data, it's not always safe. It's not always safe for the patient. It's not always the way people want to collaborate. So working with things like federated learning, which is a family of machine learning algorithms that instead of getting the data, if we want to do the best algorithm here in the house, you all send me your data and train it on all of it. But in a federated way, I design an algorithm, and the algorithm then goes to each one of you. And you run it locally. You don't send me the data, but send me just parameters of the algorithm. And that way, we can increase the diversity of the data, fairness of some of the AI work that is happening. Also, we protect patient data and safety overall.
I want to touch upon everything that you said, actually, like, since you've also mentioned Pfizer. So I'll go back. I think it's kind of nice to give examples sometimes.
Very much so. Yes.
Especially, COVID wasn't that long ago. Maybe we've forgotten too quickly, but, in terms of the pandemic and where we were, as you mentioned, when it comes to addressing the pandemic, even trying to think about the tools that were used, of course, in AI and machine learning, the supercomputing, all these things accelerated, as you mentioned. There is no way that we could have thought that we would have something, that could be used within a year or a year and a half, like Paxlovid or the vaccine. All that because of these tools that were being used at the same time as being developed. And I think it's a proof that there is a potential for these tools to be used in such a manner that could be really accelerate things for us. And I think when it came also to being deployed, because it was under emergency use authorization, you didn't have the luxury of waiting what would happen in the real world experience. So it was one of the other ways too. Many tools that we used, in fact, was like social listening, for example, using all the media in terms of what are the adverse event reportings, what could we expect, because it could help us understand what do we need to understand about this medicine or this vaccine that is being deployed. And we're talking about, for the vaccine, billions of people, right? And we're talking about millions. So how do you really capture that under shutdown? Because we were all shut down. We also have to remember everything was kind of being done in a remote way. So it's really, the potential was there, and it's really helped. I think in terms of accessing the data, I think your federated learning, I think we don't really have that yet, but there is great examples. If we look at the FDA Sentinel, for example, that uses federated learning. It was built to do safety surveillance. And this is also what helped us, in fact, to do the safety surveillance as these, because you don't get the privacy. So how do you get around protecting the privacy, right? Because the institution would have it. But just similarly, I think the AI machine learning could be used. I think this is what you're suggesting, which I think is an excellent point. There isn't really a center place where we could use, these AI and machine learning, rather than, if the concern around privacy stays within that institution, maybe it's sharing the models and using in a similar way how we use the Sentinel data that has been over I think FDA has had it more than 15 years now and has shown and proven to be very important in terms of how we could assess the benefits of whether
embedded
it's
in what
effectiveness
Aida just said, I think is a really important point for all of us to understand, which is the pace of change, which is actually extraordinary. Many of you will be familiar with Moore's Law, formulated in the mid-1960s by Gordon Moore, one of the co-founders and legendary CEO of Intel, that said that computing power would double every 2 years. That was related to how many transistors you could put on a chip. And Moore's Law held for over 5 decades, but we've now fractured Moore's Law. We've completely fractured Moore's Law. The large language models like ChatGPT or Llama or others get about 100 times more powerful each year. That's 10,000 times more powerful over the 2 years of a Moore's Law period. So that's a pace of change the human mind actually can't really grasp, but we all have to sort of prepare ourselves. That's why I think this sort of conversation is appropriate, because not only is that pace of change here, but when you look into the future, there's no indication that it's going to slow down anytime soon, say through at least the end of this decade. So the moment is now to actually have the right frameworks in place.
Yeah, I would just say simultaneously, just talking about privacy, simultaneously there's a lot of work going on privacy-enhancing technologies. And NIST just released a report last December for public comment, specifically around differential privacy and the evaluation of differential privacy technologies, how you look at those. Differential privacy, for those of you who don't know, I assume everybody up here knows, but is, if you personally have individual data in a data set, how well is your individual privacy guaranteed if that data set is used, and if it, in this case, used in AI, how well can you identify that one person? And so we've put together differential privacy guarantee guidelines and also a report on how you can assess the use of differential privacy technologies to protect individual data.
So I wanted to ask, is that part of the NIST framework we discussed earlier?
No, but it was called for in the executive order. President Biden had an executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy AI.
And on this point, just to help me out again, I'm getting my own education here. Is there necessarily a bigger tension in terms of privacy in AI versus anywhere else? I mean, the reporters, bias is AI is a voracious consumer of data, so there's more data, so there's more privacy threats. But is that any different than what you had to deal with in the past, or is it just it's the same issues, just automated?
I don't think there's a generic answer to the question.
Okay.
It depends what data sources you are actually using to build an AI model. It depends, again, on the intended use. The privacy frameworks around the world are now well established. That's for Aida and me, that's a daily fact of life that we deal with. And this is the use of artificial intelligence has to fall within those frameworks.
But I think it is important to tee off of something you said, which is to think about be transparent about the training data. People
absolutely.
have to know what data it was trained on and how it's being used.
Yeah, exactly. What's the data source?
Maybe something that is slightly different is that we have more tools to breach privacy, right, than we had in the past. So there are many more traps where data can fall, and that's something that we also have to be very cognizant about. And I think institutions are seeing that all the time. We're all getting notifications about data being hacked somewhere every day. I do that. I think we just have to build different barriers and to be ready for that. And that's a natural process.
Okay. There's not a philosophical change when you're thinking about privacy. It's just the good old privacy. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about regulations and ethics, and let's talk about actual healthcare. So I'm going to, now we've done that. Marius, at Children's Hospital, you have used AI to improve access to healthcare and in diagnoses. And I wonder, could you just talk about that a little bit? How does that actually work at the hospital?
Well, first of all, let me just ask our audience here, who's using AI in our audience? Okay, I see some hesitations, and I think also just because people don't want to put their hands up, because we're all using AI. You all look at your phone earlier today. But in healthcare...
If you have a smartphone, you're actually using it right now.
Spell check.
So in healthcare, it's been a very interesting process for AI penetration. Now, in what I do, I'm very excited about this. First of all, I think AI has an immense potential to do good in healthcare. And again, back to accessing patients, giving access to healthcare to patients. We've done in the last few years things that I never thought were possible before with the phone that sits here on my phone and runs AI. We take pictures of newborns in Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and we give a risk of a genetic condition at the time they're born. This is a place where there's no genetic specialist, clinical geneticist available. We are going to Uganda and to look at a disease. So these are kids with rare diseases, first ones. Then we have diseases that have been neglected, or rheumatic heart disease. Everybody here also thinks, just like they're using AI, that has strep throat, but you got it treated with penicillin. There are about 300,000 to 400,000 kids, mostly kids and young adults in the world, dying every year for rheumatic heart disease because they didn't get the treatment, because that's not identified early. Now you get a small portable ultrasound machine, you plug it into a laptop, and without Wi-Fi and potentially even electricity, in less than 1 minute, we can do a diagnosis. But then we look at other very rare diseases that impact kids everywhere. We look at pediatric cancers that are very rare, very severe, very impactful, and where treatments for adults don't work well for kids. So all of these are immense potentials for AI. But penetration, I'm telling you things about things that we're doing, and I think this is the healthcare of the future, but penetration has been something else. And AI has been probably pioneered by radiologists. And I don't know how many of you have heard that thing about stop training your clinicians, and was particularly said your radiologists, because AI will replace them. Obviously, that has not been a prophecy, and this is not something I believe in either. But radiologists have been antagonized by claims like this. However, they had to face the fact that they had data that is hard to read, and where technology can read it better. So 75% of the AI products used in clinics today are in the field of radiology. 5, 6 years ago, genetics seemed to be the second in the race. Right now, it looks more like cardiovascular, about 13% of the products. But I've already covered 90% of the products used in clinics right now with radiology and cardiovascular. And then what looks like is going to be the next big thing is how we're going to get surgical robotics, but particularly how we're going to improve administration and operation of hospitals. That's still because some of our clinicians are not quite ready there. As you know, we are hearing from Lori about building the trust and accountability. We don't have those rules yet established and implemented. So clinicians are starting to work with this, but are starting slowly. But something that comes from behind is the fact that the public, the healthcare patient, is not ready to adopt a healthcare system where doctors use AI technology. And there's been a recent survey coming out that was showing that 60% of patients would not be comfortable seeing a provider that is using AI. That adds up to something that I find a little bit of a conundrum. And I remember learning from one of the seminars that Research America ran that one of the top priorities for the US patient is healthcare cost, and that still remains there. AI has an immense potential to reduce some of those costs by short-circuiting some of the processes that are happening in hospitals, and I think that this is something that we're probably going to see next, much faster than seeing all those products that are reading all of our data and giving those interpretations that get me very, very excited, but the doctors and particularly the patients may not be ready to use them.
It's a really interesting sociology of medicine to have it go discipline by discipline in different areas. Are there, if there's non-radiologists and not people here, are there challenges that are sort of common to each discipline, or is the spread of it to keep it in terms of scaling to different areas that you could point to?
I mean, if I can go back to that very briefly, I think one of the big challenges is training. And Dave was talking about how technology is moving so fast. Training of our clinicians, our training is not moving at the same pace. So for something to work well, we have to have AI specialists like me, I'm a computer scientist, by the way. We talk about radiologists, clinicians in general. We have to have the governmental institutes. We have to have the providers of healthcare, the insurances, all having the same agenda and speaking the same language and working together on this. And we're not quite ready for that. I think we need to prepare our hospitals, our clinical providers with the staffing, computational resources, with the cultural shifts that are going to take place in hospitals in the very near future, are happening actually right now, and that requires training. And I think we have to invest heavily into getting everyone ready for it, because AI is here, we just have to learn how to use it well.
Yeah, I think part of how you frame that is really important, which is to start the conversation as this is a tool that the clinician can use. A stethoscope is a piece of technology. When it was introduced in the 19th century, there was actually tremendous resistance from traditional physicians. And so how do we frame that conversation as a tool, one that has to be understood and used appropriately, but is a tool that will aid that clinician. You know, clinician alone versus machine alone is not as good as clinician plus machine. And that's how we have to, I think, start talking about it.
I do think in terms of, the way we are looking at it is AI-trained clinician. I think we do need to think about the cross-fertilization, and I think that's why, I think even when we think about drug development, I think the exciting part is that you get to work with people that are actually, it's almost like breaking silos, where things were in a silo. I mean, we're talking about these AI, machine learning, deep learning, or whatever. They have been around for quite some time. They're just moving into healthcare, helping us really break those barriers. It's the same in drug development as well, working together with people that you wouldn't have otherwise, because they would be sitting in a different division doing different things. But here we can communicate. And that's why I find the multimodal AI, for example, very exciting. We talked about genomics, proteomics. We talked about, the phenotype of the patient or the health, where the health records are. But I think now it's not, the thing is that with these tools that we can get actually everything to talk about. I do remember in my lab at Stanford, a few years ago as an immunologist, like we would have a genomic, we do RNA sequencing, then we're trying to think what is the proteomic, what is the metabolomics of these few patients, whatever data that might be the biomarker. But imagine the scale now that we could use to really understand not only disease and biology, but to really address in terms of how do we target it, where do we need to target, and how to really take it, from, it's almost like bringing the bench, we talk about bench to bedside, bedside to bench, right? Bringing those medical insights back. But even in this university, I'm sure all of you would know where is your hospital versus where are the labs. But here you can really bring those things together and really bring those discoveries that are sitting in silos, those research, to really impact, disease areas and what we need to address in healthcare.
Okay, so let me hit up the panel again. What do you see as the most promising things? What is going to come? What are the goodies that, if you had to pick one? Should I start, Lori, on the end and make you go down the list, or maybe?
I just wanted to point out one thing that sort of tying on to what Marius said. So the human is always involved, right? I mean, the human-machine interaction here is really critical. And even though it's used as a really important tool in some areas, right, they don't do it without the human being involved. And I was saying in the green room, one of the things that I had done first when ChatGPT came out is I gave it a few, medical terms and then asked it to diagnose me. And then it wrote this very complete report that was very confident, right? And I think that's where you have to remember that, and it was part right, part wrong. That's where you need that expertise to come in and say, this is a tool, and the human now comes in and looks at it and says, well, you didn't think about this. And so it's really that interaction that's so important. But I think applications, the ones that I'm a biomedical engineer, and the applications that I guess when I was actually doing research that would have excited me if I was still in the lab today is really that kind of discovery of new materials, for instance, that you could use to make artificial organs, or really that discovery component would have been very exciting, is still very exciting for me, but as a researcher would be very stimulating for my research.
Do you have any? You don't violate any confidentialities, Dave.
Yeah. So the notion of human in a loop is critical in all of these pieces, that at a certain point, if we are generating a regulatory document, for example, there is a human that's then doing QC on that. Eventually, there's a human that signs saying, I attest that what is in this document is accurate. None of that will change, but you may be able to generate the first draft of the document, and we're doing this in minutes versus 6 or 8 weeks. If you're working on what's potentially a life-saving drug, and you start adding up those time savings, it has potentially tremendous meaning for patients. Let me come back to the example I briefly mentioned at the outset in terms of one of the many areas of promise, which is understanding basic disease biology. So when we are thinking about a disease, we want to think about what pathway or what alterations have occurred in genes and proteins that cause that disease. And eventually, we typically will find then a target that we can interdict, either turn it on or more often turn it off to try to prevent or cure or treat that disease. Now, that's a very, very difficult endeavor, what we call target discovery. We know, for example, now that many cancers exist in very specific subtypes on a molecular level. Breast cancer and lymphoma can be very discretely categorized based on the patterns of mutations there. Well, there are other diseases, many autoimmune diseases, for example, forms of arthritis or lupus. Let me use lupus as an example, a disorder that can affect the skin and many organs. Well, when you look at the clinical patterns of lupus, it's very clear that there are discrete diseases there. Why do some patients have severe and predominant skin involvement? Why do some patients have terrible kidney disease where in others the kidneys aren't affected? So we know on a molecular level that there have to be differences, but we don't know what they are. And so one of the things we're trying to use our human data set to do is actually to define what those molecular types of disease are. And once you understand that, then you can start asking the question, all right, is there a way to design a drug that then perturbs that system in a way that's favorable for treating this disease? And the data sets are so complicated that, in fact, I don't think there's any other way to understand these diseases than through the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning.
And it's a pretty fair thing to say that finding these fundamental drivers of disease is the key to a lot of big discoveries, rather than the very narrow that's the whole premise of research and development in biomedicine. Right? Yeah.
Right.
I'm sorry.
Sure, no problem. I think, of course, as Dave said it very beautifully, because I think it's where we are today is already in terms of where we are applying these tools to really help us. Whether it's, I think the further you are, of course, from the human, meaning the clinical trials or the launching, there is a lot of transformation, because we can think about these AI and machine learning tools that we are using in two categories. One is being operational or administrative, these documents and other things. And then there is the transformative part or component. And we did talk about these targets that we didn't know, even undruggable or druggable targets, because there's a lot now predictive models we don't have to use to go back in terms of doing these things in silico that can save us a lot of time in terms of predicting what the next step would be. We talked about Paxlovid. This was one, for example, from millions to narrow it to a few. There is the AlphaFold that is, of course, now uses this AI and deep learning to really understand how protein, because it's not just knowing the sequence of the protein, how it folds is also another elusive. And then there is active, inactive states in terms of understanding that pathway and how you really, and so these predictive models are really accelerating in terms of what we could do in the next step, which is, for example, going to the in vitro preclinical and so on. including the formulation. So for example, there is some of these tools that now we are using in terms of predicting. We have interest in atopic dermatitis, for example, disease in the skin, where there are certain tools that you can think about formulations, for example, because formulation in terms of when you give a drug under the skin, for example, the viscosity matters. And it's very interesting. These tools are helping really how these proteins fold, not only that in terms of their viscosity that you can predict, so that way you can accelerate in terms of where you need to be, right? Similarly, on the clinical trial perspective, there is also a lot of acceleration, thinking about which are the sites, like these simulations that you could do. These predictive models really helping in terms of how we are accelerating. And hopefully we'll go beyond that, of course, in terms of hypothesis generating, because right now, of course, it's about pattern recognition, predictive tools, and so on, with humans in the loop as we discussed, and especially the closer you are in terms of the early research and development, this is where there is a lot of transformation. And then, of course, but I think these tools, as we mentioned, including to post-surveillance and safety, there's just so much that, that they are being used, and the future is already here, but there is a lot of potential. And as I mentioned, we are just at the tip of it.
Right, that's one thing I didn't really understand until I started talking to folks like you, is just how much isn't known. I have this high school idea of the rubber handbook. Oh, it looks pretty thick. They must have this stuff pretty well figured out. And there's this vast space that, as far as I can tell, that there is blank space, and you need these sort of tools to dive into and explore. And maybe that's unfair. Is that a good characterization of my own off base, or how would you say?
No, I think there is a lot. But that's the thing, is there is a lot to what we could do. Of course, you could do it systematically. There is a lot of things that we do systematically that would take longer. But I think here there is a potential to accelerate, and so we're using these tools to accelerate in terms of what we could predict and where we can narrow and where we could shorten. And certainly there is a lot of unknown, and that's going to take time to get to, because there is just, as you know, there is so many unmet needs that we need to really uncover and really address.
Yeah, if you think about it, for a drug discovery and development organization, whether it's in academia or in industry, there are two existential problems. One is the success rate. It's low. At best, 8% of drugs that go into clinical testing actually make it across the finish line. 2 is what we call the cycle time. It's still 10 to 14 years on average from an idea in the laboratory to actually getting a drug into the hands of patients that need it. So this technology, I think, has the chance to attack both of those existential problems. If you could even double the success rate, I joke with my son, if I succeeded 20% of the time, meaning I failed 80% of the time, I'd be the best in the world by a mile. If you could cut that time in half to only 6 or 7 or 8 years, you would be the best ever by a mile. And here's where I think the accretion of these incremental advances that the technology will permit is actually going to allow us to address those existential questions.
Very good. Marius,
Yeah, so I have so many different answers, and I'll see if I can find a little bit of structure. First of all, something that excites me about what can happen in society, and coming back to what I mentioned earlier, is reduction of healthcare costs, because I think that's really, really important. And if the bad news was that patients were not ready to have a provider that uses AI, they're actually quite confident in having AI in the process of healthcare.
I was a little unclear on that. It seems to me it would be kind of not apparent to the patient where AI came into this, unless a robot came out and said, "Here's your pill." It's not. You don't know.
Right, but I think that's part of the transparency, right, and trustworthiness that you're discussing as well. The patient has to know what's happening with their data, with their healthcare, and they have to be comfortable with that. So that's one thing. Then there's something that I learned about last week, as Aida was talking about the fundamental level of discovery that happened, and I heard about this in a talk, and I'll repeat it here briefly. There's a company called Evolutionary Scale, if I'm now correct. You give the structure of a molecule, and then everything happens computationally. It finds, the binding, the targets, and it builds a molecule for you. We're at this point, right, where things are moving that fast. And I'm not saying that this is used in our healthcare right now, but this is how discovery happens very, very fast. Then there is the point of what excites me most in what I do, and here I have to choose between one of my babies, which is always a hard thing, but I'm hoping and fingers crossed that in December we're going to go to Kampala and we start screening 200,000 kids without access to a cardiologist to see if they have rheumatic heart disease, and you put them on penicillin and you save their lives. This is what AI can do, and it's a long story about how to make this possible and how many people have to come together to make something like this happening, that is happening with AI. And then finally, I'm going to say something geeky as well, right? And so what I think in terms of technology. I've already mentioned federated learning. Lots of studies are happening with federated learning, but it doesn't exist. It doesn't run. It doesn't connect hospital systems in a systematic way that way. Then with federated learning, I think we're going to have better clinical trials. We're going to have them analyzed more systematically, better harmonized. We'll have apples and apples in a clinical trial instead of apple and oranges when you look at different patients' data. But I also think that we're going to have in silico clinical trials in the future. And those are going to touch everything that I said until now. Cut costs, make everything faster, make it safe. We know already that pharmacokinetic and pharmacodynamic models can be more accurate than some animal studies or small clinical trials that can be hampered, again, by costs, by data quality and access, and all of that. And generative AI, of course, and foundation models. There are many, many unopened doors that can still make an impact on how we're going to see technology in the future, including generating data that we don't have, when we know how to do that well and we trust it, and that's where the human in the loop stays there, but also helping with the implementation and communication of the use of technology in healthcare.
So if I could go back a little bit to something you were saying earlier, you're working with people in Uganda, working on diseases that are maybe have less attention paid to them. How do we bring all this promise and keep ideas of equity, cultural sensitivity intact? Could you speak to that a little bit, or anyone else, I guess?
Well, I mean, I can start, and that's a very complex question.
Yeah, exactly. We only got 17 minutes, but come on.
But I think because we already touched cultural sensitivities, but we're also talking again about healthcare and digital divide. And this is something very prominent in the world, right? We want to bring AI solutions to everyone, but we cannot bring the NVIDIA superpower computing, right, that Dave mentioned before. And when we have these superpower computers, also the amount of energy that is used to run them is tremendous. Actually, one of the things that we're trying to do to keep more fairness and equity there is, and this is something maybe foundation models will solve, I think we're just looking at this as we're speaking, is that you build a model that looks at everything. Like, to go back to radiologists. To be a good radiologist, first, you have good eyes. Yeah, you can just see well. You learn how the world looks like. Then you become a good doctor. You know the human body. Then you become a radiologist and you know different parts of the body, how they appear on different kinds of imaging. AI learns better the same way. If we want to understand, to make an AI system see the world well, we teach it to look at everything that is available in terms of data from how the world looks. And then you help it focus on something like a radiological image. And that's something that allows you at some point to focus on smaller projects, on smaller data, on smaller patient populations, and run an algorithm on a smaller device, like your smartphone. But to do that as well, you have to build a smartphone, which is also consuming a lot of energy. And I don't think that answered your question about cultural sensitivities, but what is amazing about AI, at least it's been a big surprise to me, is how accepted technology is in culturally diverse environment. And I know this is a very small example to answer your question, but I worked in many countries with technology, and the place where I encountered the biggest resistance to technology has been Montgomery County, Maryland. in many other places where you think of photography would be taboo, data about your child or about your family in a culturally sensitive environment would be taboo. Actually, people are very open to using technology. And very recently, we did a study looking at large language models for health education, and this was happening in Kenya, both in urban and rural areas. And what was again surprising was not everybody was happy with this, right? And not everybody wanted to use it. Not everybody thought technology was acceptable and that they want to engage with it, but everybody, or almost everybody, thought it was feasible. They were ready to embrace it under the right circumstances. And this is where these models that we're working with now can indicate how to finesse the language, the conversation, the move of information to be culturally sensitive and to communicate with the right type of stakeholders.
Is there another facet to that question where obviously you have some populations where there's more data than for others, and that is going to lead to inequitable outcomes? Is that a concern, or anybody have any thoughts on that?
I can follow up on that as well.
I'm putting you to this.
Yeah.
Grilling
But I love to hear from the other panelists too. If we train an algorithm with data that represents a very niche population, patient population is not going to do greatly on others because we have different phenotypes, genotypes, and you name it. So something that I believe we can do better than that, instead of building a model that works for everyone the best, to have multiple models that work for the right population in the best way possible. Because we have to be able to do well with those that have rare diseases, and if we have only 20 patients in the world that have a rare disease, that's all the data we're ever going to get. We're not going to get more. So something that will work only for 20 patients may not work for the other 20 million that have been in the model. Also, there is a great diversity in our population. I mean, just the way we all in this room look different is the same. Our bodies differ, and our response to drugs and to treatment differ.
Very good. So we actually are coming sort of towards the end, and I need to ask the panelists, what they see as the future. Where are things going to go from your perspective? And I guess we'll just go down the line. Put Lori on the spot.
Starting with me?
Please.
I think one of the most fun parts of this panel discussion is dreaming about a future where AI is incorporated to really help support health, global health, right? As a matter of fact, one of the things that you sort of talked about was the ability to diagnose in rare diseases in other countries, but also the AI-assisted automated experimentation that you can do, around the world, that you could really diagnose disease much earlier and understand how disease might travel around the globe seems really like something that's possible at this point in time, or possible in the near future.
The near future. Dave, do you have?
Provided we trust the technology, right?
Sure. Well, I'm a chief technology officer, so of course I'm an optimist.
Nobody wants a pessimistic chief technology.
Where we start, I think this is going to permeate every aspect of what we do. We're preparing our organization for that. Let me come back to one point that Marius was just making about populations around the world. One fact that doesn't come out very often, but I think is critically important, is that at the level of disease biology, we humans are much more similar to each other than we are different. And while there are genetic and environmental components, at a lot of basic levels, we're much, much more alike than different. And that we can capitalize on. The new technology also has, I think, the promise. We're at a moment in time where if we get it right, we can really democratize what we do, which is what you were talking about just a minute ago. Not everyone on Earth has an automobile, but almost everyone on Earth now has a smartphone. And that's almost, for many things, the only piece of equipment you will need to participate in this endeavor. And so the question now is how to operationalize it and how to make it equitable.
So I think I totally agree. I think in terms of where we are seeing these technologies, how they can augment, right? How they can really help us accelerate and solve human problems. I think healthcare issues, I think that's the most exciting part, where there are gaps in terms of, and it's not going to be useful unless it reaches everyone. So I think that's when we have to think about equity, I think that is key in terms of about making sure that it's accessible and that actually we are involving. And I think we did talk, for example, bias, right? Bias in data. I think if everybody is thinking as we are building these, as we are implementing, as we are launching, et cetera, we can think of those. Actually, these tools can help us, in fact, address bias. So we talk about, for example, clinical trials. When you do clinical trial studies, there are dropouts, right? So there are different kinds of biases. You could have attrition bias, where now you have to deal with incomplete data set and so on. So there are predictive models people now trying to use, actually flip it, rather than seeing these AI and machine learning creating or augmenting those type of biases. How about if we can develop them in a way actually to help us really address those inequities? Democratizing, we talked about all these things, is that how can we also flip it so that actually it becomes not the problem, but the solution? And at that is that we just have to have, I do think we have to have cross-disciplinary approach, so that way everybody is working towards the same goal.
And Marius, what are your thoughts on the future?
Well, what excites me a lot about what we talked about today, and I appreciate very much everyone's perspective on that, is how healthcare has the opportunity to be smart, equitable, and responsible. And smart, we just talked about AI, a term that comes with lots of pluses but comes with minuses as well. I sometimes like to call it accelerated intelligence for healthcare rather than artificial, because we clearly all like the humans in the loop, and humans should stay there. Also to have it equitable, again, as Aida was saying, to reach everyone, as Dave said as well, the phone works very well for that, and bringing healthcare at home is going to be a big step towards the democracy in healthcare. And I'm very excited about quantum computing, and I can't wait for that to work everywhere, so that it's also responsible for the future of our planet and how we use resources in computation.
More homework for you. Quantum computing. We actually have some time. It seems fair to say, and correct me here, that I get distracted looking at drug development, and AI, but this is going to affect all areas of healthcare. Is there any advice that any of you would have for the audience if they are in the point of, I haven't been using AI a lot, and how do you prepare yourself for this coming change? Is there something they should be doing? It sounds like they should be thinking about interdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary teams, if they haven't before. I don't know if anyone could speak to that.
I just think there's been a lot of press on the maybe perils of AI.
Guilty. Yeah.
Oh no! Please talk to us more about that. But there is, and there's a lot of commentary about that, and it's all. I think we have to be go into it with our eyes open and make sure that we can mitigate the risks. And people know enough about AI that it isn't incorporated blindly or used blindly without knowledge and understanding of what the application is for, and the risks of, let's say, bias, right? Which harmful bias is critically important risk that we need to think about. So I think it's kind of one of these things that I would say the potential is amazing, but it's an eyes wide open moment. We have to really understand and be able to measure and mitigate any risks associated with our use and application of AI in our everyday world.
Dave,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, look, it's already here. When you get an EKG, it's actually read by a machine. When that first started, an expert cardiologist was better than the machine. Then they became equal. Then a panel of expert cardiologists was better than the machine. Now the machine's better than the panel of expert cardiologists. You're going to see that in radiology, in pathology, where humans are now working with that machine. So I think you used the phrase that I was actually going to use, which is eyes wide open. But that is coming, and so again, the question is just how do we do it intelligently?
And if I can go back to, I think it was 1996, and don't fact check me on that, but when Deep Blue beat Kasparov on chess, right? That's what it is. When that was an algorithm, chess is a move of algorithms. It's predictable.
It's a pure calculation.
Yes, calculation. That was. I think that's probably when AI came to the front page, right, of media. Like, well, it really works. It can really learn faster. We moved a lot, since, and we can read so much more now. And I agree with what Laurie was saying. I think the principles of how you use AI are very, very important, because we can use AI for good, and we can use it for bad as well. And they are principles. Again, I don't think we're keeping up the pace with those principles as fast as the technology is moving. We had language models that came, and large language models and vision models came on top of it. There's something coming up all the time, and we are much more reactive to this than proactive, because technology is moving very, very fast. But for instance, there are some principles that I think are important for the use of data, if we want to use the data well, called the FAIR principles. And if I remember my acronyms well, it's findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Yeah, that would be fair. It basically talks about, again, transparency and openness. Put things in open, allow others to understand how to interact with this, and this is going to gain everyone's trust. And your question about how to learn to use AI, if you haven't done it, ChatGPT. Just play with it.
Aida, can I ask your deep closing thoughts?
Oh, sure. I think it's all been said, and I think it's important. We talked about I think monitoring is also important. I think like everything else, we have to be able to measure, to understand the limitations, to really communicate, to be transparent. And I think we talked about a lot of these things, but they are critical as the technology moves. And I think there are neuroscientists who said, in fact, when we think about deep learning, the networks, it's not going to replace the human mind yet. Like, I think our brain is much more complex. We are not there. But it's really understanding the limitations, where we need to use it, where it can really augment and accelerate and help us. And I do think we need to be disciples in terms of communicating as well. And I think that's what we're doing here in this panel. I think this is very important, because we learn from each other. And I think what you don't, I like, my favorite thing is what you don't measure, you don't know how you can improve it. So I think it's very important that we continuously monitor, look back at what we are doing and the outcomes, to make sure that whatever is being developed, implemented, is actually doing what we want it to do, and addressing the questions that we want answered.
And if I could add something very briefly, I think last week on the news, there was an AI system that can reproduce the cognitive function of Drosophila, right, of the fruit fly. So there's a long, long way until it gets to the human brain.
And I just wanted to add one thing, too, about measurement, because you do need to measure all of these properties of AI and the characteristics. And that's one of the things that we're doing at NIST, is trying to figure out how to measure bias, fairness, accuracy, robustness. And we stood up the US AI Safety Institute specifically to look at how we measure safety associated with AI systems.
Okay, so we'll close on safety. I guess that's what we have time for. I hope that we've answered everyone's questions about this completely. And thank you very much, guys, for doing this. It's really fascinating stuff. Thank you for listening. We're being ushered off. The next talk will be on the future of health and the power of food as medicine. Thank you again.
Hi, everybody, and let me first thank I heard you applauding, but let me thank our last panel, Dan, for moderating, and for what I thought of as I listened, some new phrases to me, like differential privacy technology, interesting, and some longstanding concerns about trustworthiness, patient safety, and the like. And just in general, a lot of food for thought. Now you're supposed to smile now because we're going to talk about food, something we all think about every day, but in a different way. We're going to talk about it. And to help us do that, we have two experts who are way more familiar than I am with a concept called food as medicine, or food as medicine, that is moving rapidly. And thank goodness, because we're at a time in this nation where there is increasing concern about an obesity epidemic, for example, about access to nutritious food, and more. So to talk about these things, we have Pamela Schwartz, who has over 25 years of experience in community health, strategy, and evaluation, and serving now as the Executive Director for Community Health at Kaiser Permanente. And in this position, one of Pam's responsibilities at Kaiser is a new transformative organization-wide, and that's a big organization, that is working to accelerate food security, along with all of her other responsibilities. Thank you for being here. And we have Dr. Kevin Volp, who is the founding director of the Penn Center for Health Incentives and Behavioral Economics, and also is the Mark V. Pauly President's Distinguished Professor at the Perelman School of Medicine and Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. He also serves as the scientific lead for the American Heart Association Healthcare by Food initiative, which we're going to hear more about in a moment. So again, thank you both for being here. And to start us off, we're going to put up on the screen here a little bit of data from a recent public opinion survey that we at Research America commissioned with the American Heart Association to query American attitudes toward nutrition and health, food specifically, and related issues. A sampling of those findings were featured in the U.S. Health and Future of Food publication from the American Heart Association. You can see a little of the data here, and if you like, you can scan the QR code to see a really very rich data set, or get in touch with me or one of my Research America colleagues, and we'll give you the whole picture. I think one of the purposes of this work is to set a baseline about American attitudes and see where we are 5 years from now, 10 years from now, given the various initiatives that are going on. On a separate slide, you can see the question about when we queried about whether people had heard of food is medicine, really a rather new initiative. So it's somewhat surprising that about a quarter of Americans say they have heard about it. Now, we didn't ask them to define it, but it's resonating in some way or another, and it kind of makes sense just kind of on a gut level, I guess, or we want it to. So just with that in the background, Kevin, I'd like to start by discussing your work with the American Heart Association. Can you tell us a little bit about your role on the new initiative and what you hope to come out of it?
Sure. Well, first, let me highlight a few additional statistics and thank you from the American Heart Association for the great partnership in doing this survey. So one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting was about 77% of Americans recognized that they would like to have healthier diets, but the number one obstacle people raised was affordability. And about 60% of people said that affordability was a challenge. More than 50% knew families with children who said that they are struggling with affording healthy food and paying the rent. More than 50% knew seniors who were struggling with paying for prescription drugs and paying for healthy food. So the Heart Association's Healthcare by Food initiative is really focused on trying to accelerate progress in learning about what is effective, what's cost-effective in improving health for people with diet-related chronic conditions. Think about obesity, diabetes, heart failure, coronary artery disease. where we could do a lot to try to keep people healthy more proactively if we had a better sense of what kind of programs might work, might be cost effective in improving people's health. So we now have more than 250 people around the country who are working on this initiative. It's academics from more than 20 academic institutions. It's representatives of more than 24 community-based organizations. It's representatives of a number of corporations who are helping us test these ideas at scale. And we now have 23 projects that are either launched or launching. 21 of them are randomized trials. The AHA has spent $8.5 million on these projects. And just for perspective, that is about the same amount as all of NIH spends on food as medicine research each year. Wow. So there's a lot to learn. We are excited about the prospects, but we need to move faster.
Wow. That's quite a stunning statistic or amount of money to be devoted. But the problem we know is getting more and more out of control. So it's critically important. Pam, tell us about your work at Kaiser and what you feel is the most important thing you can accomplish and what you might be struggling with right now.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. Maybe I'll just start by saying, so I'm Kaiser Permanente, and Kaiser Permanente is the largest nonprofit integrated healthcare system in the nation. And so what that means is we're health plan and providers working together to care for about getting close to 12.7 million members across 8 states and then here in Washington, D.C., and also with about 70 million people that live in our communities. So we think about the health of our members, the health of our communities, and then also how we have a voice in the national dialogue, like what we're doing here. So maybe just adding, before I get into what we're doing, adding some statistics which look a lot like yours, but we did a study surveying our own members. It was a representative sample of 10,000 members that we asked about their social needs. And what we heard was very similar to your results. We heard 60% of those folks were struggling with their finances. We heard that 25% didn't have enough, they reported food and or nutrition insecurity. We added a screening for nutrition security because we wanted to understand the difference, if there was one, between food insecurity and nutrition insecurity. So 25% reported either food and or nutrition insecurity. And when we looked at the Medicaid population, so the population on Medicaid plans, it was 50%. So 1 out of 2 of our members with Medicaid plans are struggling to not have enough healthy food to eat. So those numbers are really real, and for us, they translate to millions of people. And so we think about everything that we do at scale. And so I just want to say a little bit about how we got here, because we started in, I think it was 2018. Our CEO at the time, Bernard Tyson, he asked the people of Kaiser Permanente, so about over 200,000 people, to put forward their best ideas for how to create healthy lives. And there were thousands of ideas put forward, and what rose to the top was food insecurity. And so that's how we got started. In 2019, we started with a SNAP enrollment campaign. And today we have over 140,000 people across all of our markets, so all of those states that I mentioned we've helped to submit their SNAP and now WIC applications. So and we also were moving to building the evidence, similar to what Kevin described, knowing that we need more evidence in what works and under what conditions for food insecurity, for food as medicine. And more we're seeing food as medicine woven into the fabric of healthcare. But to your question about challenges, one thing that is still missing for us is more about what works under what conditions. So we can make business decisions on what types of interventions for which populations, for what duration. So super exciting to have the work that you all do. We also lean in on evidence generation. We committed to the White House Conference on Hunger, Nutrition, and Health. We gave a $50 million commitment to accelerate our food as medicine work, and then within that to also continue to build the evidence for the research. So that one of our biggest challenges is around making sure we understand the most impactful interventions. And then I'll say one more thing, that I'm proud and a little nervous to say that just in April, we launched a Food as Medicine Center of Excellence. And it was based on the NIH framework that they put out last summer, and I can talk more about that in a bit. But really dove into what is the framework that the NIH has put out and how do we operationalize that inside a large healthcare system. And then in April, we said, ready or not, here we come. So that's also a challenge and an opportunity as well.
So I actually was going to ask you if you're working with the NIH. You both mentioned NIH for various reasons, and how is that operationalized?
Well, we see NIH as arguably the most important funder in this space. We would love for them to do more. When you look at the fact the U.S. spends $4.3 trillion a year on healthcare, we're first in healthcare spending, we're 48th in life expectancy. We could do better. There's a lot of research that needs to be done to figure out what works for whom, what dose to give a patient with heart failure for how long, what's the comparative effectiveness of this approach versus that approach. I think a lot of those questions need to be figured out. In the meantime, we are paying for a lot of very expensive medical care for a lot of people with a lot of needs, and we would love for NIH to step up and provide more support.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the NIH put forward a framework, we grabbed it, and we operationalized it inside healthcare, so that's one thing. But we also have world-class research units in all of our markets, and a lot of them receive funding to look at the health of our members and also our communities from NIH and other funders like NIH.
So we all, I'm sure everybody in this room would like to see NIH have more funding for this and a whole number of other things, including the areas that you're working in, which rely so heavily on behavioral research findings and improving all the time as to how we work with different communities. And I wonder if you could just speak a little bit to the different kinds of experiences and learnings you're finding as you talk to different groups in the population, different by any measure you want to address.
Well, maybe I'll start with just the kinds of studies we've invested in since we started the Food as Medicine work. We started with SNAP enrollment. We had a study around that, like how do we make sure we're getting the most people enrolled in SNAP that we could. And then we also turned to medically tailored meals. This was in 2020, so at that time the evidence was relatively sparse, and so we wanted to take a look at the most effective interventions. It was COVID. It was a very hard time to be doing randomized controlled trials. About a year into that, we also moved to produce prescriptions, which was pretty new at that time. It was not a lot of evidence, and we started what we understood at the time to be the largest randomized controlled trial. It was on a very hard-to-serve population in California, Medicaid population, mostly Medicaid, not all, but mostly, with diabetes, and we gave them 6 months every week a box of produce. It was actually medically tailored groceries, but those words weren't available at the time. So it was a box of mostly produce with some other things. And proud to say that we are we have a publication under review right now, but we saw lower A1C in our intervention group. So really exciting finding. And then before that, even before we had the findings, we took a look at what we were learning from the participants, and what we heard was that people wanted choice. So people wanted more choice than a box curated for them, and so we went into a partnership with Instacart to really think about, okay, if we curate a list of healthy items, have it delivered to their house. So we gave them $100 from a curated list of mostly fruits and vegetables, similar things that were in the boxes, but this time you pick your own, and we marry it with culinary medicine, with recipes and cooking videos, and we're in the middle of that trial right now. It's also a randomized controlled trial. It's in, I think, 1,100. There's 1,100 patients in the trial. We're about halfway through, and really exciting to see what might be happening there. But where we offer, we're hearing from a lot of our patients and members that choice really matters to people, and so wanting to make sure that we're building interventions that offer choice, that teach people how to cook if they want to cook, so that the behavior change lasts longer than the intervention.
Sounds like a real partnership these individuals. They're volunteers, but you're listening to them and learning from them, which was a big theme from our program yesterday.
Yes, we have a lot of human-centered design in how we've built our strategy from the very beginning. So at the very beginning, talking to people who are food insecure. Then we started talking to, as we built out the rest of our portfolio of interventions, we looked at WIC, we looked at maternal and child health, and now more recently at food as medicine, trying to really co-create with the end users. And so the end users being the members and patients, but also now being the care teams to make sure that the interventions that we're designing are what people want to either refer to or use as a patient.
Right. Well, shockingly, we're running out of time. Kevin, tell us about something particularly exciting that you're finding right now.
Well, I think there's enormous room for improvement. You asked who are some of the parties that we talk to, and we talk a lot with both private and public insurers. We talk a lot with self-insured employers. And everyone, just like everyone wants NIH to spend more on research, maybe not everyone, but many people, everyone wants more healthcare for less money. And that's, to me, the real question in front of us. How do we figure out what is most cost effective in improving health? Yeah. And that is really what our North Star is figuring out how can we test this in a very systematic way? How can we test this in ways that where scaled implementation is possible? And how do we do it with partners where this can then be turned into scaled programs? It's really, I think we're at an inflection point where there's a lot more interest in recognition of social determinants of health and how they contribute to healthcare costs, but not enough good data on what to do if you're going to prescribe a program, if you're a clinician, if you want to cover a program as a payer. We need to really nail down what is most cost effective for whom.
We all salute you for this. I know we're going to hear lots more from you and others working in this critically important area, and look forward to the next times. So Pam, I think you have to rush off, but maybe you have a minute if you want to grab her after this session, and Kevin may be able to stay longer if you've got more questions for him. But we've got to move along here. So please join me in thanking Kevin and Pam. Thank you so much. And there is going to be more. But I want to now turn the stage over to Dr. Kafui Dzeras, a neuroscientist and HHMI investigator at Duke University, and I'm happy to say a Research America board member, who's going to be joining us on stage now to moderate the next discussion that's titled Revolutionizing Medicine, the Promise of Novel Therapies and the Future of Innovation. Thank you. I'll make the intro.
So am I sitting next to you? Is that all right?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Mary. Good afternoon. I hope everyone is doing well. I am Kafui Dzeras. I'm the A. Eugene and Marie Washington Presidential Distinguished Professor at Duke University and an investigator with the Howard Hughes Medical Institute. And I'm really excited this afternoon to be here talking with you about revolutionizing medicine, the promise of novel therapies, and the future of innovation. And I'm joined here by my esteemed panel. I'll give them each a brief introduction. Dr. Matthew Hall, who serves as the Scientific Director of the National Center for Advancing Translational Sciences at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. Peter Marks, who is a Director for the Center of Biologics Evaluation at the United States Food and Drug Administration. And Dr. David Sergel, who is Global Head of Cardiometabolic Development at Novartis. So I'm super excited, as I mentioned, to be here. I think looking at the title, we all know what medicine is. We're all excited about therapies, and we're excited about innovation. But I wanted to just start off by asking the panel to weigh in on this idea of novel, right? What makes the therapeutics and the technologies novel? Is it just because they're new, or is there something that's intrinsically different about them? I'll ask each of you to weigh in on that.
I'm happy to go first. So I think what we're talking about when we're talking about novel therapies are things that they're things that you would not have anticipated yesterday. I think we're all familiar in the news recently. There are things you wouldn't have anticipated yesterday that have happened that now they're a reality. Those are novel. Some things are novel in a bad way. We're trying to do novel in a good way. And I think novel in a good way would be the ability, moving gene therapy was novel at one point, but the potential for genome editing in a very specific manner within someone's genome to correct a mistake or potentially insert a piece of chromosome to fix a piece that's missing. Those are really, to me, that's novelty to be able to practice medicine at that kind of molecular level.
Yeah, I'll go from gene to small molecule. Sure. And 10 years ago, if you made a molecule, all you could do to a protein is stop it from doing its job. And what chemical biology and the research enterprise has done over the last 10 to 15 years, we can now make a protein go away and degrade it. We can bring proteins together that should never have been together, and modulate a whole lot of different biology, and it's completely reinvigorating and changing how we develop small molecule drugs.
Yeah, and I guess going from the science to the patient, I mean, ultimately a novel therapy has to meet a patient need, right? So there has to be a reason for being for this novel therapy, that makes patients' lives better or longer.
So you sort of mentioned, Peter, this term genome editing, right? And sort of a genomic therapy. There's a lot in sort of the lexicon about like genomic and cellular-based therapies. What are the differences between them? Can you help orient us to sort of that landscape? Are there sort of different diseases or illnesses?
Right. So I think we hear everything from cell-based therapies to gene-based therapies to cell-based gene therapies. And so there's this concept of cellular therapies where you're giving back a cell type to fix something that's missing. I think we can, an example of that would be we now have allogeneic pancreatic islets that can help alleviate or cure diabetes when administered to people. And so that's an example of a purely cellular therapy that can make a difference. At the other extreme, we have gene therapies now that can be administered directly administered into a vein that will treat hemophilia, or Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, or certain other metabolic diseases, and a whole host of them are under study. And then in between, there are ways that we have dealt with some of the problems with cell therapy. Cells are notorious for doing whatever they want to do, so it's hard to actually make a cell therapy that works. And one way to make it so that cell therapy works is to add a gene. And the chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapies or the genetically modified hematopoietic stem cells are a way of doing gene therapy outside of the body, which allows you to have an extra measure of safety, give them back, and the cells do what you want them to do. So there's a whole spectrum from cell therapy, cell-based gene therapy to gene therapy. Ultimately, I think the reason, again, why I would say the novelty of these these genome editing-based technologies is they may jumpstart and leapfrog us forward to having therapies that are not able to be applied broadly across the globe to therapies that can actually be applied in everything from a high-income country down through to a low-income country.
You mentioned a couple of things that were really exciting, and whenever I'm doing a panel, I always think about the doctors that will be taking care of us one day, so the high school student that's out there. So I just want to make sure I got it right for them, because you described two really exciting novel and emerging therapies. The idea that in an illness like diabetes, in which you have your body attacking a cell type in your body that makes insulin, so you can process glucose or sugar, you can now make cells that your body won't attack, and you can put them in somebody's body as a cellular-based therapeutic. Is that sort of the
Well, people are working on getting to that point. Right now, it requires some immunosuppression, but people are working now on taking those cells and encapsulating them in various ways so the body won't attack them, or genetically modifying. That's again but that gets you to genetically modified cells that allow one to avoid this immune response that can otherwise happen. The beauty of the advances in genome editing that occurred just over a decade ago where that things that used to be that we could do them, but they were very challenging to do, we can now do so well that we now have animals that are made that are genetically modified, that we can harvest genetically modified organs from, so that a field that was nearly dead a decade ago, xenotransplantation, has been revived because of essentially animals like pigs that now can be made that are potentially producing organs that will be easier to transplant. So yet another development to add to the novelty.
Yeah, I think this idea of unexpected and unanticipated really anchors this panel. Would you mind commenting a little bit more on some of the unexpected or unanticipated developments in small molecules? You started mentioning
I think clinically it's unexpected if you're hanging out watching the drug development world, but it's not unexpected if you're watching the research world, right? And so, if you've got your finger on the pulse of, I don't know, I know my boss's boss is in the audience, something like $40 billion goes out from the National Institutes of Health every year to fund research in biomedical research in the United States. If you're absorbing that science, that's where a lot of the innovation and experimentation happens. And then we all live in this interdependent ecosystem from a therapeutics and a patient solutions point of view. And good ideas, whether they're platforms or individual opportunities, are taken up through the private sector, enabled by the government sector, and get to patients.
So, you mentioned a little bit earlier, David, about the importance, and Matthew just mentioned this as well. We have to get this to patients, right? At the end of the day, that is our broad range goal. And so there's all of this exciting stuff happening in the research community, as you mentioned, $40 billion. Thank you, Director, getting it out there to support this innovation. But somehow it has to get to patients, and something has to happen in the middle of that.
Right.
Yeah.
Sure.
It's
I mean,
okay.
after decades and decades of scientific endeavor and a lot of experiments that show that a particular pathway or molecular entity might actually be useful for a particular disease, we have to run clinical trials to prove it. So we run, for example, in cardiovascular medicine, we run very large-scale clinical trials to show that a new cholesterol medicine or a new blood pressure medicine can actually improve patient outcomes in a population. And that requires a huge collaboration between the academic community, the research community, the patient community, to be able to get those studies done. I mean, because fundamentally, if you think about it, over the last sort of 50 or 60 years, cardiovascular disease has been fundamentally transformed, right? So 50 years ago, the cardiovascular mortality rates were 75% higher than they are today. And then over that time frame, we've had interventions like public health interventions, like smoking cessation. We've had the introduction of blood pressure guidelines and blood pressure medicines. We've had the introduction of statins, all of which have made a huge difference to public health, right? But at the end of the day, cardiovascular disease is still the #1 killer, right? So we still have more work to do in that space, and it's really translating all of this work, finding that unmet need and that next target and that next medicine that's crucial to really make a big difference for public health.
I think we're all, as scientists and clinicians, filled with a tremendous amount of hope, right? Where science and medicine and engaging the American public can really help moving forward this area of revolutionizing medicine and improving the health of our nation and world. But I can imagine that upon hearing this, there might be some people at home worried, right? They're hearing editing your genome and changing out cells. How do you make sure all of this is safe? And Peter, if you could sort of comment on like the regulatory landscape and where are we going with thinking about the regulations of gene therapies and cell-based therapies?
Yeah, so I mean, first and foremost, any novel is always scary. I think it goes without saying. Our job, though, is to make sure that before something makes it through the process, that it gets to patients in general practice, it has been well studied and well understood. It doesn't mean that it's 100% fully understood, but we use a risk-based approach. And try to make sure that we understand that the product is manufactured well, that we understand what are the potential pitfalls in the manufacturing process, that we understand the clinical data for effectiveness and for safety, and we also understand something very important, which is what we don't know. And we also know that we don't know what we don't know. We try to take that all together, and we use a risk, benefit, and uncertainty model. And many times when you see us approving things today, where sometimes it sees, well, why are they approving this? It's because sometimes the risk-benefit is in a place where there's a sufficient benefit given a small amount of risk that it's the right thing to do. If you have a child that has a lethal genetic disease and you have a gene therapy that we see has a 90% chance of preventing that lethality, even if there is a 1% chance of something bad happening in the future, many people will select that this is something that they would proceed with. And as we have more experience, generally we get more and more knowledge of what is going to happen, and the uncertainty decreases. And in some ways, our accelerated approval of drugs is just based on, we still have the same effectiveness standard. We still have to make sure the products are safe. It's just that we approve things under accelerated approval with more uncertainty than we would once we have clinical endpoints of how people feel, function, or survive.
So, just now, David, you mentioned this idea of getting more people involved in clinical trials. And Research America has done some surveying and found that the majority of Americans want to know more about clinical trials and how to access them. The NIH has started recently making some investments in building a primary care framework that will reach into rural communities throughout this country. So there are opportunities to connect in the clinical trial framework. What sort of opportunities and challenges do you think exist in the framework of clinical trial recruitment and on the pathway to ultimately getting these new treatments to patients?
Yeah. So it's interesting. We're talking about two different scales in this discussion, right? So we're talking about gene therapies or ultra rare diseases where you have a transformative therapy for a relatively small number of patients in many situations. And in some situations, we're talking about, especially in cardiovascular disease, we're talking about tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people who could benefit from therapy. In that latter, so I'll focus on the latter category, but the former category isn't unimportant. It's of course clearly important that we make a difference for individual patients.
And we've got 23 minutes, so we'll
Okay. So I think the biggest challenge for cardiovascular clinical trial recruitment is that there are so many opportunities, right? The challenge is the number of opportunities. Clinical research on a medicine doesn't stop with the first approval or with the first clinical trial that shows that a drug is safe and effective. We typically continue to explore the use of that medicine in a variety of patient care settings, for example, in the hospital or in primary care settings, patient conditions, for example, other indications. So we were talking about platforms earlier. A single drug oftentimes is a platform, right? It's a platform for continuing to grow the science in a space. So there's where the real challenge is, because we have so many opportunities to build on that we need more advocacy, we need more patients involved in clinical trials, we need more investigators involved in clinical trials, a broader landscape where to conduct those clinical trials, so we can get into a variety of communities as well. So there are many, many opportunities, I think, to advocate for more awareness for clinical trials and to get more patients to participate.
Yeah, I mean, I think the pandemic helped us see what's possible because we started to, I think, increasingly realize that we've been talking about real-world evidence for a long time. I think for these larger populations, we deal with also large populations. We handle the vaccines, and I think there's a great example of how we can use large amounts of data that can be collected from a broad array if we are willing to think a little differently, bring the research to people, start to leverage technologies that are very powerful that we haven't fully leveraged in terms of data collection, such as wearables and doing trials closer to home. I mean, one of the successes of the pandemic was being able to have vaccine trials that actually enrolled a true cross-section of the American population. I wish we could do that on a regular basis, and in part that's because when you have enough trial sites, you can get close enough to people. So I think we can leverage technology, provided people aren't too scared off of technology, to help bring trials closer to people and to let more people participate. And some of that also will probably mean improving our medical record systems. That's a whole talk for another day, but it is impressive what we could do with big data.
And remote sites or at-home trials, right?
Yes,
so,
exactly.
I mean, we stood up naively right at the beginning of COVID, which feels like 20 years ago, but unfortunately it's not. You know, a study that just to look at, who has antibodies against COVID, who's had it. And we said we'll recruit 100 people, and we had like 400,000 people fill out the web form. So we recruited 10,000. We mailed the samplers to their homes. No one went anywhere. They did their own blood spot, and they FedExed it back to NIH, where we did all of the analysis. And it was a perfect representation of the US population as a result. So I think there's huge opportunities for studies as well, in some cases as for trials. And that happened with COVID studies too.
Yeah, I'd love to stay here with your comments for a minute, Matt. As Dave was talking on one of the former panels, Dave Reese, he said there's so much about us that is more similar than what makes us different, right? But I certainly remember a time in medical school where I was learning about medical history and realized that there were clinical trials without women in it, right? And so I do think it's important for us to think about strategies in which we can make sure there are more people involved in clinical trials. So I'd just love to stay here for a minute and maybe hear more about how NCATS is thinking about, with translational science, how to make sure we have more of the American population in it.
Yeah, well, first of all, it's absolutely critical. A lot of what we think about are rare disease populations. And we know now, I mean, we're really good at identifying the genetic basis of disease. We have over 10,000 diseases. Nearly all of them, maybe 5%, have treatments or therapies. Most don't. And, we were invoking platforms before. I think we know there are, thousands of diseases where we have a pretty good idea about what a therapeutic opportunity would be for them. But the challenge of getting, investment to develop therapeutics for those diseases is extremely challenging. Understanding all of the human population, not just in the US, but globally, it's been amazing what we're seeing with electronic. I mean, in 5 years, what has happened with electronic health records, their digitization, the utilization of them, not just to understand that population, but to generate hypotheses about what's possible, to identify patients who may be eligible for clinical trials. All of these processes are really being enabled by, maybe the greatest platform of this year is, electronic health records is sort of the number one thing we talk about.
So all of you have used this term platform or platform technology, and I want to make sure that each of you have sort of oriented the audience to what that refers to, both in the significance of drug development and its potential for scaling. So if you could just unpack that term for us.
So from a regulatory perspective, there actually is a formal definition of what a platform is. It's the stage where, the platform, the idea of a platform technology is simply one where the idea would be that it is something in common between multiple different products or multiple different entities. So the idea would be that it's something that can be reused multiple times to facilitate, ease the drug development process. In the current Platform Technologies Act of 2023, as part of the Omnibus, it allows a manufacturer who's making one product to show that, well, if they're going to make a second, third, or fourth using that same method, they don't have to go back and describe all of the preclinical information and all the manufacturing information again and again. They can just reference it, and that is potentially streamlining a lot of cost and time. Now, ultimately, it's possible that if the logical extension of that is, could this be extended to allowing a given technology to be used across different companies if they use the same manufacturing technology. We're still not there yet. That is probably a place in the future. But the idea here is it's essentially energy saving and time saving.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that I'd probably raise it up to that level and say when we talk about platforms, typically we're talking about anything that improves efficiency, full stop. So you're talking about commonality in an indication, so a particular disease area where you might have multiple molecules that you might be studying. There's an efficiency there because it's easier to set up your clinical trials, figure out your endpoints, write your protocols, right? Manufacturing, if you're making siRNAs, for example, or you're making a gene therapy, you get better and better with it the more scale you have, right? And then, there are other types of platforms. Like I said, a molecule itself can be a platform. So the more familiarity you have with a mechanism of action of a drug, the easier it is for you to go from one disease indication to another disease indication and expand. So we call that also apply. So there's a variety of ways in which we use the term.
Yeah. I agree with everyone. I mean, and I think it's an attractive concept because if you really do create an efficient platform, for example, for drug discovery, vaccines are a good example. If you know the sequence of the pathogen, in theory, you can dial up a genetic sequence and start creating a vaccine, and we've seen that happen as a rapid response mechanism. If you do that well, you can bring treatments for a lot of different diseases in parallel that are amenable to that same approach.
Yeah. So I think you mentioned RNA. I think mRNAs have now sort of hit public consciousness. And it sounds like that's something we could consider as a platform technology. I'm sort of wondering, where do we stand, right, in terms of where these technologies are, and what do you see as like the greatest promise ahead?
Wow. I'll start with, mRNA technology has been around for a decade plus. It really came to blossom, obviously, in the pandemic in terms of vaccines. As a vaccine technology, it turns out to be, it's not perfect because it can't be used for every different infectious disease, but it is very versatile, and most importantly, it's very quick. It allows us to respond rapidly, and manufacturing mRNA is very different than manufacturing a small molecule drug, or more so even manufacturing a gene therapy or a cell-based therapy. So it's a very flexible technology. It's very amenable to a platform approach. For vaccines, it's allowed us to move from one COVID-19 vaccine to another and do so easily. With assurance that the safety we saw with one will be the safety we will see with others. And 5 billion doses later across the world, I think we feel pretty confident in the safety profile of these. But mRNA is now finding its way into a place which is novel and potentially transformational, because our problem with gene therapies that prevent us from, for instance, fixing cardiovascular disease by bringing everyone's cholesterol down half, by knocking out PCSK9, which we could do theoretically very easily with a gene therapy, and which people are trying to do for hereditary hypercholesterolemia, we just can't make enough of it. And with RNA technology, the mRNA technology, we possibly could ultimately, because there it's a platform which, because it can be made using bacterial or synthetic means rather than mammalian cell culture, and because it can be delivered in lipid nanoparticles, which are, again, something we know how to make very well, you could see that scale up. And my suspicion is if we look a decade or two down the road, we may actually see some of the more common disease starting to be addressed with gene therapies, because we'll be able to scale them up and make them cost effectively enough. Right now, the cost is just so different. And that's something we didn't mention a lot, is that science has gotten ahead of manufacturing technology. So we have great science, and it's taking a little while for some of the manufacturing technology to catch up. The beauty is mRNA technology is one where it may provide us with kind of, an opportunity to catch up that we weren't expecting.
I don't think we talked ahead of the meeting really too much about this, but the good news is the future is today. So we actually can deliver long-acting genetically targeted therapies to manipulate gene products. So for example, we could administer a drug, and this is, again, thinking about novel small molecules. siRNAs today can be administered twice a year. And back when we were in medical school, I don't think we ever really thought about a medicine as being twice a year or maybe even once a year administration. You think about a daily pill or 2 or 3 times a day or something like that. So RNA siRNA in particular, and antisense oligonucleotides can be created in such a way that allow us to target very specifically disease-associated proteins, knock them down in the cell, not change the genetic codes, not gene therapy, right? It's called genetically targeted therapy, so slightly different, and yet deliver something that addresses a major unmet need. For example, the biggest issue we see for many chronic asymptomatic diseases is people don't take their medicines, right? So half of people who are on antihypertensives or on statins stop taking their medicines after a year. If you can deliver something twice a year that takes that part of the equation out, that part out of the equation, it's a major potential public health advantage.
And I think I was just going to add that, when you think about these, there are companies founded on individual discovery platforms. So I often think about medicines as being proprietary, but platforms, sometimes it's more of a secret sauce than anything, but being proprietary and the basis. So there's incredible opportunities for value creation, going from, say, an academic technology into a biotech and sort of spinning out into that ecosystem. And I guess, mRNAs are a really great example of a platform technology. One thing we learned during COVID is that you really are limited by the disease and the timelines associated with it. So look at antibodies, right? We know we can create an antibody that's therapeutically safe to put in humans and get data from a clinical trial maybe in 9 months. And we're at a point where we had 4, 5, or 6 neutralizing antibodies for COVID. But then we had 0 because the virus moved even faster than really fast platforms. And so getting the right platform and the right approach for each disease is absolutely critical.
The other thing about these platform approaches that may be really exciting about this kind of concept of once or twice a year, or in some cases gene therapies, is that we could have transformation for global health. I think if we in the United States create a transformation for high-income countries only, I think that's a catastrophe for global public health, because many diseases that we're actually able to manage reasonably here are life-limiting or their death sentences in other countries. And if we can see these types of treatments become reduced in cost of production, ease of delivery, that you can deliver something, they come to a clinic, someone goes to a clinic once a year, gets a treatment at a reasonable cost, it could be transformative to global public health. It can make a huge difference. And I actually think this is one of these things where for us, it's the right thing to do. It's probably good for national security, and you can make a whole bunch of stories of why this is a good thing to do. At the end of the day, it's the right thing.
Yeah. So I had a next question, but then you mentioned this idea of people not taking their medications. And I'm a psychiatrist, so that immediately made my bells go off. So I wanted to ask about platform technologies in the area of brain health and neuroscience, maybe Alzheimer's or depression. How are folks thinking about it in that space?
So at least in the Alzheimer's world, people are trying to figure out ways that they could deliver things that could be a once we have the monoclonal antibodies, which the idea is that you don't want to intervene late in the game. The idea would be to try to intervene early. And so a variety of companies are looking at vaccine-based approaches. The idea is if you could clear protein before it created the problem, that would be the time to intervene. Those are still early on, but they're of great interest because the number of people, most people fear Alzheimer's more than they fear death. So I think trying to do something about that is probably a good thing. And we'll just have to see where these things are. It's slow. The problem with as you're well aware, is the CNS is like the great challenge that's left here because of how challenging it is to make progress.
Platforms are only useful if you understand the disease.
Right, exactly.
I've, as a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, have been incredibly excited about the investments that the NIH has made in the Brain Initiative, really trying to understand what the basic biological function is of the brain, hopefully giving us an understanding of science and biology that these platform technologies can be built on. So, yeah. All right. So I did want to, sorry, I sort of took my moderator liberties with the last question. But sort of going back to this area of infectious disease, because we were talking about COVID before. So I turn on my TV, right, and I see cows with bird flu. I hear about West Nile. I hear about, dengue and other infectious diseases sort of showing up. And I'm sort of curious about how you all are thinking about these platform technologies sort of in the area of infectious disease more broadly beyond COVID, whether it's siRNAs or mRNAs or other technologies on the horizon.
Well, I kind of shared an opinion about antibodies, and you need to be tackling the right virus. I think for vaccines it's incredibly promising, and I know that at NIAID they've launched programs and for antibody development. They had an announcement this week about that, and vaccines as well. I do think there's an incredible opportunity sometimes to recognize that preparation is more valuable than a platform that's ready to go. I worry. I heard someone in the AI session a little while ago that was really interesting. Worry a little bit that we're already forgetting what we learned. And right now we can make all the antivirals we need to be able to drug the 20 most threatening viruses. And that opportunity is right there in front of us to create safe antivirals ready to go, right? It's just one example. And so I do think that there are opportunities prepared, but it takes investment and energy, and it's in a very competitive landscape, right? If you're asking people to develop medicines for diseases that may exist, right? That's very challenging when, as I said, 95% of human conditions don't have medicines. So it's very competitive.
So.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, I think I totally agree, and I think some of this is a matter of having the discipline to not forget. It is, I think, I have witnessed too much COVID amnesia, where there's just been, we know how we need to address certain things, and you could witness by how we responded to H5N1, the bird flu, that there was clearly COVID amnesia. I mean, I as somebody who I think we have a pretty good playbook put together by the time that a lot of the work was done for the pandemic on the vaccines and the monoclonals, and it was not memorialized in our brains. Perhaps it was memorialized some places on paper, that we just did not roll that out again. And so I think that is, we do have to fight this complacency that can occur, this desire to forget what happened, because it's likely to happen again. We're in a warming world. These viruses we're gonna come in contact with animals that are gonna come and bring us some other not nice thing. Hopefully it won't be a global pandemic, but we have to be prepared to respond.
So we're almost at time, but I'd like for each of you to take a minute to maybe comment on one area or dimension in drug development that you think doesn't get enough attention.
Well, I guess I'll start. I don't know, maybe Matt and I are going to say the same thing, but I mean, it's really, I think the term novelty tends to be applied to things like cell and gene therapy. And they're amazing discoveries, and they've transformed the lives of many people. There are so many innovations that happen in the small molecule world, whether it's being able to more specifically target an agent, a disease pathogen, or do it safely or more effectively. Sometimes we miss out these really critically important, but what we would call incremental innovations that can have huge impact over the long term. And I think we sort of ignore those things at our peril. I think giving the due to those important advances, I think is a critical thing for us.
Matt, I'll let you go.
All right. So I'll say something a little different then. I mean, I really think a lot about and worry about all the rare diseases that no one's ever even tried to develop a therapeutic for. You can't develop therapeutics if you don't understand the basis of disease. And so many diseases, collaborators I have are the parents of, the only child in the United States with the disease, or one of 50 children in the United States with the disease. And the need to understand the molecular basis of every disease, to be sure we can take advantages of things like platforms when they come along is absolutely critical, because we want all children and everybody to have the treatments they need for all diseases.
And I'm going to take kind of try to unify here between small molecules and novel gene therapies and mRNA. At the end of the day, our ability to bring treatments to people is only as good as our supply chain that allows us to have the raw materials that we need, and then the manufacturing capacity to make these products. And we were very lucky that we just kind of squeaked by during the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think as we look forward, that is essentially an important place where we can't lose sight of that. If you don't have the supplies and you can't make it, you can't bring and deliver these treatments to people.
Well, it looks like our time is up. I want to thank you all for being here this afternoon. If there's anything that I'll take home from today, I'll borrow your quote. The future is today. So thank you all again. And now we're going to turn the stage over to our keynote from our director of the National Institute of Health, Dr. Monica Bertagnolli.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Come on now. You just had an amazing panel and has got your mind working hard. And that's great because, 4:30 is usually when I get a little tired and I'm ready to maybe start pulling back from thinking. But in fact, this is not the moment to do that, because now you're about to actually have your mind grown even more by our keynote speaker. So first of all, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sudip Parikh. I have the privilege of serving as the CEO of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, or AAAS. And I also have the privilege of serving as the Research America Board Chair. And today, I get the pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, the 17th Director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. Monica Bertagnolli. And Dr. Bertagnolli is the first surgeon and second woman to hold the position of NIH Director, and she oversees the work of this agency that I don't have to describe to you all because you all know what it is. It is the funding agency for biomedical research, the largest funding agency for biomedical research in the world. There's a long introduction here that I talked with Monica about, and she says I don't have to read it. In fact, what we're going to say instead is that if you have gotten a chance to meet her, you know that this is a director of the NIH that cares deeply about patients, that cares deeply about the country, and that cares deeply about advancing science so that we can do well for both. And that is what you want in an NIH director, and also someone who happens to know how to do surgery and run a complex $47 billion agency. And that's what we have in Dr. Bertagnolli. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Monica.
Wow, thank you, Sudip. And it's just wonderful to be here. I want to thank all Research America members, research advocates, and really everyone joining us here today. I'm really grateful to be able to have this time to talk to you about a few things. I'm going to start with some things that I think are of great concern, worrying trends in the health of the U.S. population, and how biomedical research can play a critical role in addressing those trends. I'll also discuss two things that are critical: the importance of fundamental research and cross-disciplinary collaboration, something that really needs great emphasis. I think I've just gone there. I know the theme of this year's meeting is straight talk. And so I don't think I can be more straightforward than this. The health of the U.S. population is declining in several really critical ways, and NIH, absolutely, this is what we must be about. In terms of everything else we do, we must respond to emerging health challenges. This decline is happening despite significant advances in biomedical research in the last decades that have led to life-saving interventions for a range of diseases and conditions. I mean, think about cures that we never thought possible that we're seeing out of immunotherapy across multiple diseases, not just in oncology. About gene therapy and the incredible promise of that. just to name a few dramatic examples of where scientific discoveries have enabled breakthroughs in medicine and very soon in the way we practice medicine. However, despite this tremendous progress, we're really deeply concerned that the overall health of people in this country appears to be getting worse, not better. Well, we've just come through a pandemic. We know we are dealing with downstream effects from that we hope are going to be waning, but we're not seeing them wane as quickly as we want, and we're also worried that some of these will be enduring. These trends are also, importantly, exacerbated amongst certain groups. It's just the slide. U.S. life expectancy is of concern. It's no longer steadily increasing. We saw major increases over decades, but since 2014, there's really been a slowing and even a decline. And this, you can see what happened with COVID, but you can also see that we haven't caught up yet after the decline we've seen with COVID. Our life expectancy ranks, this is the worst part, ranks very low compared to some of our nations with prominent economic status. We are low compared to our peer nations. And this is even though we spend, as we all know, much, much more on our health system. The decline in life expectancy, we also know, due to work done by the national academies and others, is largely driven by an increase in mortality among working age adults. So, what can we do? A whole of society approach is required. We really feel this way at NIH. We know we have our focus. We are the nation's supporter of biomedical research, but for all the problems that we tackle, we need to even look well beyond NIH, take a whole of society approach to address health. Biomedical research, though, certainly can play a very key role. Our knowledge and technology have developed to the point where we should be able to deliver evidence-based, data-driven healthcare to every patient and have observations from clinical care inform our evidence base back. Why are we not doing this? It's not a technological issue. It's a social engineering issue, and we really need to think about that. Here's another thing that we take very seriously. If you look at a map of the United States, you can see hotspots, more cancer, higher mortality from mental health issues, substance abuse, higher the diseases of despair that we hear about that are behind some of our mortality deficits. And you can take that same map, and when you overlay it, those are also the same populations, the same areas where we have far less representation in research. Research data is especially lacking for populations who are older, uninsured, belong to minority groups, or live in rural locations. And this is where we have the poorest health. There are many barriers to clinical research. And by clinical research, I also mean the ability of the patient in the clinic to inform how we develop our technology. It's not just, I want to be very clear, when I think about clinical research, we think about that as being one component that has to feed the full spectrum of what NIH does. Barriers could be ranging paying for transportation, taking off work, coordinating childcare, language barriers, lack of cultural competency among study staff even, or limited health literacy, and lack of trust in medical institutions. I'll also say that participation in research is a feature of high quality care. I mean, we see this over and over in our major academic centers, which are delivering wide varieties of clinical trials and other research opportunities for our patients. And when we study this, we find that it is a feature that is associated with better care. Critically, though, it's also important for engendering trust in new healthcare discoveries. When you participate in a research study, when your community has been engaged in research itself and can directly see how it's addressing a health problem of concern to you, you are going to trust the ultimate intervention that arises from that research. And I'll just remind everybody again that you can take that same map of disparities and everything else, and that's also the areas in our country where we see the least trust in in medicine itself. So, not a surprise. So what about NIH? NIH must support research that encompasses the laboratory and the clinic. Talking about this forever, but we also increasingly understand that our work does not stop at the door to the doctor's office or the clinic. It must extend deeply into the communities we serve. As just one example, we currently have a renewed emphasis on improving the health of American people by addressing social determinants of health and environmental justice. We know these influence health. To do this, we must eliminate disparities in health outcomes, not only by studying healthcare delivery to find a way for those who lack access to healthcare to receive it, but we must also pursue other important goals. For example, technological innovation that can address how environmental factors present in communities, toxic exposures, the results of climate change, affect our cells and tissues in ways that influence health. New technologies that allow us to deliver point-of-care diagnostics to rural clinics. So again, it's the marriage of technology and actual healthcare that is going to help, and that includes critically some of our most underserved communities. We envision a data-driven health system in which research and insights from patient care are constantly informing each other. Our work spans a range of studies. For example, the range of studies that NIH needs to encompass in order to influence health, everything from applying more innovative third-generation cryo-EM techniques that can look at the dynamic interactions of proteins, all the way through to research that we're doing with our Native American communities, integrating their cultural practices and traditional healing practices with medication for treatment of chronic pain. We need to really encompass that full spectrum. So, a couple of things that we have recently launched to do exactly what I'm talking about here. In June, we launched in pilot form, a program that's very close to my heart. Care for Health will allow NIH to connect with primary care providers and their patients, giving them access to research and the opportunity to participate in clinical trials and other clinical research projects. By engaging people on the front lines of healthcare in communities that have traditionally been left out, we'll build an infrastructure that will earn trust and lead to sustained relationships with primary care researchers and patients. One of the things we haven't done very well, particularly in communities that are challenged, is we've taken an individual, institute, and center approach to them in the past. Think about it. Go into a very resource-challenged rural location and say, we're here, we want to engage you in research, but we're only interested in cancer screening, and oh, by the way, when the grant runs out, we're out of here. That is no way to start solving these critical problems we have, and no way to build this continual learning environment we need to see. So, many of people with health disparities lack access to medical care. They also lack access to specialists, but the primary care provider, including nurse practitioners and other physician partners, are often the frontline provider for every health issue that arises. I know this well. My own uncle, who I adored, was a Veterans Administration doctor who traveled all over Wyoming, and somebody needed to have an appendectomy. He could do it. He delivered babies. He took skin cancers off of people's ears. That's what primary care providers do in these rural and under-resourced locations. And so we need these people. And we need to be able to see what they do on the front lines of health. Care for Health is looking to integrate research into the reality that we see in these communities. We're starting small. It is a 2-year, $30 million pilot phase prioritizing research hubs that can enroll and work with rural communities. Building trust in research is a key goal. So we're going to ask members of the communities what their health concerns and needs are, and what research, and then give them examples from across all of NIH. We have 2/3 of our 27 institutes and centers have relevant research for a primary care environment. We'll ask these communities what research they want to do. It's a new approach to community engaged research. Ask them first, not come in assuming what we know what they want. Across all of the institutes and centers of NIH, we can present now, even today, so many options that address critical health needs, whether this is substance abuse, mental health, diabetes, hypertension, obesity, maternal health, cancer screening, and more. After the first year, we aim to broaden participation so communities throughout the country can participate more who have this need. During the pilot phase, we will learn what the communities select as what's important to them. That'll help us focus, and also what it takes for primary care providers to be successful in engaging their patients in research. These are often doctors and other caregivers who just have packed waiting rooms, difficulty getting through their day. They don't have an extra 5 minutes to fill out data sheets for research. So we also better be smart about using our technology to enable them to be able to participate. Ultimately, we believe this will have a meaningful impact on health outcomes, especially among those who have historically been underrepresented and underserved in research. A next big, ambitious initiative. I've talked about connecting the laboratory, the clinic, and the community, and the importance of integrating across the full spectrum of what NIH does. Think about the clinic when you're conducting basic science. Think about contributions to fundamental science when you're sitting in the clinic. What binds this all together and makes it possible are data. We have an abundance of data. We've been talking about this forever, especially now. It's been going to be 2-year anniversary in January, where NIH said if you're going to get a grant, you have to tell us up front how you're going to make it possible to share those data. But we haven't built the infrastructure, the tools, the environment that can really help our community do this. Machine learning has completely changed the way we think about data, particularly highlighting the need for data to include everyone and to analyze data in ways that prevent bias in the results. However, we also need to ensure that we have not an ad hoc data ecosystem, a carefully designed and considered data ecosystem that works for us in 2024 and beyond. We're at an inflection point right now. Data are scattered across various entities. We've had some wonderful examples of teams that have been able to show how you can use data even across international boundaries to achieve success. I'll call out the genomics community for a big round of applause in being able to do this, to now, through big data sharing initiatives with diverse collections of genomic data, be able to identify many more causes of rare diseases, for instance. So we've got some good examples out there, but there's thousands of ways that we're not doing what we should. Our vision is to dramatically expand the programs and capabilities of the National Library of Medicine and make the NLM the epicenter for NIH-funded research to advance information science, innovation in data analytics, and data science. Among other things, we aim to integrate data from basic and social science research, public health, and clinical care. That's also done in a very ad hoc way right now. Increase the capacity for data hosting, enable low-cost access to data using open industry data standards, and support broad access to advanced analytics and computational power. I know it's ambitious, but I think about, again, when I was a high school student in a small rural high school in Wyoming. If I had an idea, I wanted to ask a question. with the help of my high school biology teacher, could I go to the National Library of Medicine and get access to a data set and be able to look at what some famous research laboratory at a prominent institution had been able to produce? Think about that kind of equality and access to what we have in our data, and the ability to not only empower everyone doing research now, but inspire even those who haven't, who are in the learning phase. So that's also an important part of this, people who are learning. We'll employ a federated architecture for data work, and I'll say it again, provide education and workforce development as an important part of this effort. If we can't properly catalyze the shift to a federated biomedical research data sharing infrastructure, properly catalyze this shift to a federated biomedical research data sharing infrastructure, we can significantly accelerate advances that will improve health. Outcomes-based applied research won't flourish without curiosity-driven basic science. I want to underscore the critical importance of this. At NIH, we're accountable to the American people. We're called on to justify how we spend our taxpayer dollars to achieve our mission. And understandably, this often means we're asked how and when we will make progress treating specific diseases. This is how we ended up with 27 institutes and centers as focal points for this important interest in specific diseases. We also often receive our funding from Congress with a requirement for studying specific diseases. And of course, I am certainly focused on expanding translational and clinical research and data-driven healthcare delivery. But we all know that basic research is foundational. Practical progress comes from supporting curiosity-driven science. You all know this quote. I'm just going to give you an example, a very contemporary example of how lost we are without fundamental science. COVID-19. COVID-19 arrived on our shores. We had had 60 years of hard work into RNA, into its capabilities for being able to modify protein development in cells. We had, from the time the very first SARS showed up, work looking at the spike protein and finding ways to stabilize the spike protein so that it could stick around long enough for the immune system to be able to generate a robust response to it. And so when COVID-2 hit, we were ready to go with the vaccine once we could look at the sequence immediately. But then, only 3 months later, long COVID showed up. And we're lost. Why? We still, believe it or not, despite so many years of knowing about post-infectious sequelae, don't have the ability to diagnose a live replication proficient virus in a human being as a biomarker to decide, is this active virus causing this disease or not? We haven't developed that technology. This is a fundamental science question. What's the technique? So without that, we've turned to really rigorous, absolutely necessary clinical diagnostic procedures for long COVID, but we need a biologic diagnosis. We need to know how to correlate that with severity. We need to know what our targets need to be. The Recover Initiative is soon to be producing results showing that, assuming that it's viral persistence that might be behind some long COVID with extended antiviral therapy, but that has been an assumption and it shouldn't be. So in one disease, I give you an example of how we can fly if we have the fundamental science behind it, and how we need so much more fundamental science if we're going to respond to new threats like long COVID. Maybe many years before a strand of fundamental knowledge which might be of interest only to a few experts helps lead to a new therapeutic agent or other application. And it is impossible to predict, believe me, everyone has tried, where important discoveries or insights will take place or who is going to be the researcher producing them. Supporting a broad and diverse scientific portfolio maximizes our chances for breakthrough. And, I know you all understand this. Demonstrating these principles, we know that the development of any new drug, any new therapeutic, has to stand on the work of thousands of scientists at thousands of organizations, often over decades. This is why NIH remains deeply committed to sustaining a broad portfolio of investigator-initiated basic research, maintaining the workforce, which is also critically important, and NIH has an outsized role in that. And in support of this, we currently spend at least 50% of our annual budget on fundamental science. Fundamental research is critical because it addresses multiple underlying principles that span organ systems and diseases. We need to harness more collaboration and cross-cutting research across disciplines and agencies if we want to deliver more innovative solutions. Our bodies have so many critical functions and biological programs required for maintaining health. We have to heal wounds. We have to be able to have our bodies be able to manage fluctuating nutritional inputs, fluctuating metabolic inputs. We have to be able to fight off infections. These are healthy, important, normal programs, and when they go awry, we have disease. For example, as a clinician scientist, I spent my early career studying how inflammation can lead to the uncontrolled cell growth that initiates and maintains a tumor. But we know inflammation plays a role in autoimmune disorders, Alzheimer's disease, diabetes, musculoskeletal disorders, many, many, many of the things that plague us. This interconnectedness means that targeting a mechanism shared in common can be used to treat or prevent multiple diseases, and we at NIH are also focusing much more at this cross-cutting view. Also, many healthy habits can reduce the risk for conditions like diabetes, heart disease, and cancer, that if they appear to reduce chronic inflammation. And a good example, making these connections, is the story of the glucagon-like peptide 1 receptor agonists, drugs developed to treat metabolic dysregulation, originally for type 2 diabetes. But as we got them out into the world, not before, as we got them out into the world, we started to see how they benefit patients with obesity, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, cardiovascular disease, and have an ability to induce satiety and reduce cravings that holds promise for treating substance use disorders, tobacco use, and other harmful use disorders. We learned that and have gathered data through our use of data from the clinical care environment, being able to feed back and fund more fundamental science. I think this is a brilliant example of that and how we can move forward. So before I finish up, I want to share 2 core principles that guide our work across NIH. First, progress is accelerated when advanced scientific methods such as new data analytics are applied to data that includes everyone, and when new discoveries are rapidly and equitably adopted in clinical care. The basic science, fundamental science, technology arena needs to inform clinical care and vice versa. And then second, our work is not finished when we deliver scientific discoveries. Our work is only finished when all people are living long and healthy lives. We should celebrate our successes, aggressively pursue any opportunity to uncover the fundamental nature of health and disease and develop new treatments. But we have to remain humble in the face of human suffering and approach our work with great urgency. And as I started this talk with today, there are very important populations out there who really need what NIH can bring to bear. People are counting on us. So with that, I will close. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak. And thank you, Research America.
Wow. feeling wow. I'm feeling wow. I just, I had some prepared remarks, but I just felt so much alive about the purpose of advocacy, the things that drive me. I am an advocate, you all know that, but the things that inspire me about it. And what inspires me is a vision like Monica's, a commitment to the whole of society, the use of pictures of people and patients as a way to describe the NIH. I remember once getting a publication, it was several years ago now, that was a very important publication from the NIH back in the days of hard copy. And the front of it was Building 1. Building 1. So this got me thinking, what we need is people, not pillars, on a building. NIH is all about people, all of us, everywhere. And I think Monica captures that just beautifully and lifts us up to be part of a vision that's possible. It is possible. We can be in communities. We can be connected. And that's really been a theme all along, yesterday and today, the importance of connecting to people, of connecting data also, and the data comes from people, after all. There's just so many ways that we can take that line from the last panel, the future is today, and keep focusing on a better future every day for all of us. And with leaders like we've listened to in the last couple of days and just now from Director Bertagnolli, we're going to get there. And advocates are going to be there every step of the way, every step of the way. If you are already an advocate, thank you. If you can do more as an advocate, this is a good time to be doing it. Talk to us about some ideas in that regard. I want to thank everybody that's been part of the programming yesterday and today, and to let you know that you can access it via our YouTube channel and in other social media, everything, yesterday and today. We'll let you know how to do that, and encourage your colleagues to touch base, to take a look at sessions that you were particularly impressed with, and for you, look at ones that maybe you missed, because there's some real quality going on for sure. I know that a lot of people provided some true straight talk, Monica did just now, focused on what we haven't done yet. They also gave us straight talk about what's possible, reminding us of recent things we have a lot, several of which we have to celebrate, and giving us a glimpse of what is to come. We're going to get there, and it takes working together. I want to thank our sponsors most profoundly. It wouldn't be possible for us to provide programming at this level that's open without fee to anyone who would like to join without our sponsors. So I'd like to suggest a round of applause. I also want to thank the Research America Board of Directors. You really are a big part of the secret sauce of Research America. Thank you for serving. And for those of you who have been board members, I've seen some of you in the room, just as I've seen some former employees and fellows and interns keep coming back. Thank you. Thank you for being part of the Research America family. And thanking our members also, and those who maybe have thought about being members and aren't yet. We want you to join us, please do. I want to thank the staff that put this programming together. And that means, really, we're a relatively small organization, 30, 32 staff. Everybody worked hard to produce this program. But I want to give a special call out to Samantha Sam Miller. Where are you? Do I see you there? Who led us today. Thank you. Thank you. We want to keep the conversation going. We invite you to join us across the street for a reception, kindly hosted, as is this session, by GW. It would be great to talk to you one-on-one and for all of us to meet new friends. But most profoundly, thank you for the work you do every day, and thank you for your advocacy, and we want to work with you more. Thank you. Good evening.